Good afternoon to everyone present here. This is Divyarati Ghosh, faculty, Bijoy Krishna Girls College, Department of English. I would welcome you all to the second day of the international webinar entitled Literature and Gender, Past and Present. And it has been organized by the Department of English and IQAC, Bijoy Krishna Girls College, in collaboration with Lady Brabourne College, Department of English and IQAC. I take this opportunity to thank the principals of both the colleges, Dr. Ruma Bhattacharya, Bijoy Krishna Girls College, and Professor Shivli Sarkar of Lady Brabourne College. And special thanks and special mention must be made of Ms. Suyasha Mookim, head of the department, head of the English department, Bijoy Krishna Girls College, and Professor Sanjukta, head of the department, English head of the department, Lady Brabourne College. Before we get started with the academic session, I would request Dr. Sweta Guha, IQAC coordinator of Bijoy Krishna Girls College, if you could speak a few words. Dr. Sweta Guha.
Thank you, Divyarati. Good afternoon and a warm welcome to the second day of international webinar on literature and gender, past and present, organized by Department of English and IQAC Bijoy Krishna Girls College in collaboration with Department of English and IQAC Lady Brabourne College. For centuries, society tends to assign different role, code of behavior, morality to men and women. Actually, biological distinction has led to a social distinction. As literature reflects our society, it illustrates how women are defined, treated, and how the physical beauty has become primary consideration while assessing a woman's worth. It is an honor to have with us Dr. Shati Ganguly, Professor Visva Bharati Shantiniketan, as today's resource person. Thank you, ma'am, for being with us today. And I must thank Lady Brabourne College, my alma mater, for collaborating with us in this webinar. Thank you, Principal Madam, Dr. Shivli Sarkar, and Dr. Indrani Choudhury Dotto, IQAC coordinator of Lady Brabourne College, and all faculty members of English department of Lady Brabourne College. And all my best wishes to today's paper presenters, both students and teaching faculties. And I must thank all my dear colleagues of English department of my college, of Bijoy Krishna Girls College, for organizing a very well organized webinar. And lastly, I'm grateful to Principal Madam of our college, Dr. Ruma Bhattacharya, for always encouraging us to organize any academic activities in college. Thank you, Suyasha, and all the best. Hope everything goes well, and I wish all of you a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Sweta-di. Thank you, Dr. Sweta Guha. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our next guest, our next speaker, our resource person for the second day of this international webinar, Dr. Swati Ganguly, Professor, Department of English, Visva Bharati Shantiniketan. Dr. Ganguly is a professor of English at the Department of English, Visva Bharati, as I mentioned. Her doctoral dissertation was on gendering the grotesque in Renaissance drama, Apart from Renaissance culture and literature, her areas of active engagement include feminist studies and Rabindranath Tagore and his times. She received the Charles Wallace Fellowship for Translation Studies in 1996 at the UEA Norwich and the New India Fellowship for writing a book on the history of Bharati. She has translated and co-edited with Sharmishta Dattagupta The Stream Within 1947-1997, translation of Bengali women's short stories 1999. She has co-edited 2 anthologies of essays on Rabindranath Tagore entitled Rabindranath Tagore and the Nation, Essays in Politics, Society and Culture in association with Bharati 2011 and Towards Tagore, Bharati 2014. Her book on Tagore's University, 1921 to 1961, is forthcoming from Permanent Black. She has also attended several international conferences and have been invited to give talks at Rome and Naples and in annual memorial lecture at the IIT Bombay. She has published in international journals and Indian journals of repute like the Economic and Political Weekly. Several of her essays, including those on gender and literature, have been published in anthologies by prestigious publishers. Dr. Swati Ganguly. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Divyarati. Am I audible? I don't have a headphone.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
you
madam.
are.
Yes, madam.
Thank you. Well, it is highly embarrassing to sit and listen to one's sort of CV as a kind of introduction. Ideally, of course, I would just like to say that I am I'm a feminist and a person who has an active engagement in women's writing and questions of feminism and women's writing and other aspects of culture. It gives me great pleasure to be invited in this for this webinar, international webinar on literature and gender. And I know how tough it is to organize conferences, having done several, and especially how tough it is to organize it during the exceptional times of COVID. I would sort of extend my heartiest thanks to the organizers, both colleges, Vijay Krishna Girls College and Lady Brabourne College, to the principals of these 2 colleges. Shivli, I have known for a very long time. We happen to live in the same apartment complex. I don't stay there anymore, I stay in Shantiniketan. But the person who I would really want to thank in a major way is Suyasha Mookim, who has been in touch with me, sending me messages, communicating with me, and generally sort of, been a great help with my rather silly questions at times. I would also like to thank Nabanita, who I believe is the person responsible in some senses for suggesting my name. So what I would like to do today is, I'm assuming that my audience is primarily students, and so I would like to address them. And in so doing, I will probably also be addressing my colleagues who are familiar with many of the things that I would like to talk about. Thank you, Sasha. What I have been listening to yesterday's sort of deliberations, including the keynote, and as well as some of the other sort of presentations, and it occurred to me that we may go back to some of what we call the basic conceptual categories of the 2 terms, literature and gender, which in my understanding has not really been sort of, discussed at at any length in the course of the first day. So, which is a wonderful thing, which gives me a leeway and moments to sort of come in and share with you my thoughts, as we often say, my two-penny bit on the question of literature and gender. I generally do not like PowerPoints, and thank you, Nabanita. I generally do not like PowerPoints. I find them restricting. But in this particular case, since it is a webinar, I just also felt that a PowerPoint might be a way in which you can have yourselves focused on some of the issues which I would like to raise. So the PowerPoint is really to peg some of the things that I believe are important in the context of literature and gender. I will try to make this presentation as accessible to students as possible, because I think that is what we are looking at in webinars, that we have a larger number of students coming in, especially when it concerns gender, the politics of gender, the question of gender, which is something that is integral to. Yes, someone raised a hand. No, so is integral to our existences in ways which many other categories may not necessarily be, though I believe increasingly we are looking at questions of caste and I would say other politically nuanced positions as readers, as participants, and so on. So what I really wanted to do today, begin off with showing a series of images. I think that's a good way to begin. Share, right? Do I say share? Yes, okay. Right. So right. So the topic of this webinar is literature and gender. So I subtitle it as Remembering Her Story, Past and Present. I think it is very interesting that whenever we use the word gender, we almost assume, without an exception, that we're talking about women. However, gender is a category which should and does apply to men, women, and trans people. So I think this is one of the ways in which gender operates in our society, often by not addressing or by erasing or by making invisible the fact that gender as a category is not exclusively for women, but is a construction, as was mentioned in the initial sort of introduction by Sweta. It's a construction, it's a construct which affects the lives of both men and women and also trans people. In this particular talk, of course, I am focusing on the question of gender as it pertains to women. I think it is very important to clarify these basic sort of tenets as we go along. So I call it Remembering Her Story. I will unpack the meaning or the use of the word her story, typically as opposed to history, and talk about how this remembering of her storycizing, if I might use the word, from between, let us say, the beginning of the 20th century to the present, that is also a time period I'm choosing, is something that we may wish to underscore and remember by remembering, by putting together also a feminist term. So let me state at the very outset that this is a feminist inquiry. Any discussion of the question of gender, especially as it relates to literature, cannot ever position itself outside of feminist thinking, because feminists were the people who had introduced the category called gender, or gender as a category of analysis, both for the reader as well as for the producer at the very outset. So this is unapologetically a feminist presentation. What I wanted to do, and this is especially for the students, was to give you certain images, right? Images of women reading and writing. Now, you may as well say that they're just reading and writing, and what has it got to do with literature? It is possible that their very acts of writing, for example, like journals or letters or diaries, have now increasingly come to be included in the category called literature. In other words, the domain of literature as it was understood 40 years, 50 years ago has widened appreciatively. So we don't think of literature only as the generic categories of drama, poetry, and prose, or its subdivisions into kinds of poetry, kinds of plays, or kinds of fiction. We have learned to understand how intimate voices of personal experiences, communications between two people, even communication not meant for two people, but just meant as a way of self-expression, maybe of self-doubt, as in the diary. All of these have come to constitute a very important marker field of literature. In these two images, which I downloaded, of course, from the Google, I find it interesting because we are looking typically at women of the past. A past which is definitely not the Renaissance, not the early modern, but of modern. So modern as in 18th century and onwards. So we're looking at women probably 18th century or 19th century. And probably from their clothes that they're wearing, the kind of desks that they're seated at, we could say that they are probably not women who belong to our immediate times. They are women who I call belong to a privileged past. They are privileged because obviously you would not find women being educated or women being getting the leisure to be able to have a space where they could sit and write. So we're looking there at okay, so this is an image of women reading. It's a kind of comparison that I wanted you to focus on. That's a lot of sound. We have the sound off, please. Is this mine? Is this Okay, so these are two images which I wanted to bring together. A woman sitting and reading by the window. Once again, very clearly, a white woman, a European woman who has the privilege of having to herself a window and sitting by what seems to be a garden and reading. And the other, the one on the right, very clearly a woman of color, probably a black woman who has learned to read. Is probably, it is her first experience. She seems to be in a space which is undefined, but it could be regarded as a space which is also in some senses devoid, as it were, of her class identity. She could be a black woman of also slave origin, the kind of woman that Alice Walker talks about. I'm using the same image on the left and another which I found startling image on the right, saying that we could think of these as acts of reading, which could be transgressive in the past, to the present on the right, the image of a woman, it could also be a trans person, who is clearly enjoying herself. She's reading what seems to be a book, a literature book, and she's in a situation which is clearly one of pleasure, So these two images I found very interesting. These are Dokra images. One of them, the one on the left, is very famous. There are similar ones like these about the woman who is sort of reading, and there is one on the right which shows more clearly a woman who's focusing or concentrating on her reading. We could think of these as interventions of changing ideas or perception of women. So this is folk art, and we are clearly looking at a very radical shift between what would have been understood as traditional or stereotyped roles of women carrying their children, carrying products which are of use in the domestic space, to something which is startling, especially in the context of folk tribal people, the act of reading. Right. So I think I wanted to share these images with the students in particular, to everyone, because I think these are very interesting ways of entering into the domain that I call literature and gender, especially because till the 1960s, as late as the 1960s, gender was not a category which was ever considered while reading literature, while analyzing literature, or talking about the writings of women. So we're looking at what can be called a phenomena of the modern, or something which is the beginning of, let us say, late modern. So gender as a category of analysis in literature. If you're thinking about literature as a specialized kind of creative activity, then it is clear that there may have been exceptions from classical times up to the 18th century. Sappho, for example, is in the Western canon, is a very, very important poet, somebody who was revered by the male writers of her times. And there are many instances of women who wrote during the medieval period, during the early modern period. But as a conceptual category of the woman as the reader and author, this is a phenomenon which is linked to what we would call modernity, that is the 18th century, the Enlightenment. Right. Now, I don't have time to go into the history of this, but we could suggest that Mary Wollstonecraft is probably one of the first writers, known primarily as a liberal feminist or a person whose treatise, Vindication of the Rights of Woman, is one of the most important pleas for women's education. I would say that Wollstonecraft also does what we may call one of the early incursions or excursions into the category of how gender inflects literature. In her reading of Milton, in her reading of Milton's Eve, in the way she reads conduct book writings, in the way in which she reads Rousseau and Rousseau's Emile, I think Wollstonecraft is doing a very interesting analysis of how literary texts, both canonical and non-canonical, construct gender in a certain kind of way. So that I would consider as one of the very early instances of making gender a category of analysis. That is, how you represent and what you represent is an act which is necessarily based on your gender, on whether you're a man or a woman. Of course, Wollstonecraft is not interested in talking or thinking about the working class or people of race and color. She is primarily interested in the white middle class. But it is a very important, I think, category which is coming in as early as the 18th century. But in a major way, I would say, the idea that gender can become a tool of reading, can become a system through which we understand the production of literature or the acts of reading literary text, actually come in only by the late 60s, right? And it is really an effect of the way in which the second wave of feminism, also called radical feminism, starts beginning to enter institutions, beginning to sort of affect the way in which we read history, the way in which we read politics, and definitely the way in which we read literature. So some of you, or maybe many of you, are familiar with the trajectory of this feminist intervention in the reading of literature, especially as far as the Anglophone world is concerned. So let us say Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, which was a best-selling PhD thesis, is based on the fact that women's representation both in canonical and popular literature, is shot through with a certain kind of misogyny or women hating, a misogyny which is often expressed through sexism or delineation or representation of women as sex objects. So she looks at D.H. Lawrence, Norman Mailer, Henry Miller, and suggests that this is something which is internalized in the act of writing, especially in the writing by men. There is a lot of problem with Kate Millett's assumptions, and these have also been questioned by later feminists. So that is one kind of analysis in which Millett is looking at how mainstream literature, especially literature by men, have constructed, have represented relationships of gender, and especially how it has represented women. The other kind of reading in terms of gender, which is coming in from the late 60s and from the early 70s onwards, is what Elaine Showalter very interestingly calls gyno-criticism. Gyno, of course, as you mean, woman criticism. It is premised on the fact that women, when they write differently. So when we're looking at the category called women's writing, we're looking at, and this is not known as to how this difference is constructed. So there is a debate on whether this difference is constructed by biology, by our positions in society, or relationship with language, relationship with psychoanalysis. But the position seems to be that it is very important to recognize that when women write, they write differently from men. So these are really the two categories in which gender becomes a category of analysis in literature. So from the late 60s onwards, through many writings, I just mentioned Millett and Elaine Showalter. We could think about Adrian Rich, we could think about Alice Walker, we could think about Betty Friedan, we could think about Mary Ellman. So all of these, and I'm concentrating almost entirely on the 70s and 80s, through which women's studies, women's writing, women as producers of literature gradually begin to gain ground. So the interest, for example, a renewed interest, for example, in the writings of Mary Shelley, right, who wrote Frankenstein, begins only with feminist thinking of the 70s and 80s. The fact that this is just not merely the first science fiction, but it is a very complex narrative, which is a critique of romanticism, which is a critique of patriarchy, which is a critique of the way in which classes operate, the question of the self and the other. All of these became important and came to the foreground, came to the fore with feminist revival or interest in someone like Mary Shelley. Even someone like Charlotte Bronte, who was a very, very popular writer in her own times, received a different kind of attention as a feminist, as a liberal feminist writer in her text, Jane Eyre. Right. So you find feminism actually becoming a very important category in the reading of something which we would otherwise call just a popular romance. That it becomes the story of Jane and Jane's moral, social, ethical progress from being a dependent woman to a woman who can claim at the end, reader, I married him. So the question, as we would say, of a certain kind of agency and empowerment, the two terms which have been used in this conference in some thoughtful way, in a thinking which was shared to be by Suyasha, which I will use in the next few sort of this next discussion, in the next few slides. Where I will focus on a specific kind or a specific text, literary text, which is a text about what I call her story. So just to go over known grounds, her story is it's a typical feminist usage, which came around in the 70s and 80s, as opposed to history. So history was his story, drawing attention to how masculinist bias in all forms of history writing, political, social, economic, and cultural, have either erased women from this narrative or have sidelined them or have reduced them in a certain kind of reductive way. So one of the things feminists are suggesting is that we have to provide a counter to this. And how does one provide a counter? By bringing back the stories of women who had been erased from the narrative or who had been excluded from them. And they chose the term her story as a conscious opposition to counter to history. Mary Daly, who we read when we were in Jadavpur University in a major way, whose book Gynecology made her very famous as a late radical feminist. Gynecology, gynecology, that is ecology which centers or which is centered around women. So Robin Lakoff has this very interesting essay about language. All language is man-made languages. So if language is man-made, if that is the way in which things, meanings are structured, then how do women intervene in this larger process of what is called the grand making of the man? Where is the position of the woman? And the fact that gender neutrality is just a myth. So with this in mind, I move on quickly to the many ways in which her story has been narrated, and there are many instances. I'm just looking here at two. On your left is Virginia Woolf, known primarily as a modernist, as a writer who introduced, though she didn't actually, but who practiced the stream of consciousness, also a pacifist, and one of the very important people to have shaped what we call high modernism. And on your right is Alice Walker, famous black feminist who coined the term womanist. Here she is shown reading The Color Purple, which is an iconic text of lesbian relationship, of sorority, of the way in which women's histories are necessarily brought, or women's histories have to factor in intersections of race as far as Alice Walker is concerned. So how the story of black slaves, the story of the blues singers, the story of women who made quilts is very different from the way in which we have understood women's creativity. We've understood the question of literature and gender. How much time do I have? Do I have any time?
Yes, ma'am, you have. Can continue.
Okay, great. Okay, right. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to say that your slides are not being visible. It's not moving actually.
Not moving?
No, we are stuck at the first slide, the title slide still.
Good heavens. Why is that happening? Well, I have no idea as to why this is happening.
I think
maybe you shared your window or have you shared your screen? Maybe you should share your full screen.
Sorry, share my full screen. How does that happen?
Wherever when you
click on when you want to start.
Yeah, now it's moving. We are on a slide called a room of one's own.
Is this moving?
Yes, I can see a slide called a room of one's own now.
You can see a slide called room of one's own. Gender as a category of analysis is what I'm looking at here. Can you see that slide of a woman reading?
No,
no, I'm looking at the slides, a room of one's own, the idea of a room past and present.
The idea of a room past and present, can you see this?
Yes.
You haven't been able to see any other slides?
No, we were stuck at the first slides so far.
Well, that's very strange. So give me an idea as to how one bypasses this problem. What do I share?
It could be that your network is slow.
Good heavens.
Just click on the slide that you want us to see and it will display on the screen. Just click on whichever slide you want us to see. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, now the slide is changing.
Woman reading and writing?
Yes,
ma'am. Hello.
Okay, excellent. Yes.
Excuse me, ma'am. Please means make the slide means press Control F5 so that the slide plays on. It is in the
F5.
yeah, it's in design mode.
Wait, F5. Okay, can just tell me if you can see this image?
Yes, we
ma'am.
can see the
Okay,
slide
great.
screen.
So it was not the question of enter, it is the question. Okay, so just remember what I had spoken about, and you can just look at these images. Women reading different pasts, a woman, a white woman, a woman of color. Okay, can you see this one? This has two images, one of both of black women or women of color, one on the left and one on the right, the past and the present. Does the title read Women Reading Past and Present? No?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Right. So there, this image of Dokra figurines of women, one on a chaupai or a bed, and the other woman who is reclining, who is supine. No, sorry, not supine. Who's lying on her stomach and reading. Can you see that? Can you see this? Gender as a category of analysis. It's a woman who's reading.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. History and her story. I've gone over this.
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, great. History and her story. I'd spoken about Mary Daly's gynecology. Okay, great. This is where I had stopped for a bit and spoken about Virginia Woolf and Alice Walker. Can you see them both on the screen? Virginia Woolf and Alice Walker?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so the reason why I put Virginia Woolf and Alice Walker next to each other is because it is profitable to read A Room of One's Own alongside In Search of Our Mother's Gardens by Alice Walker. So these provide two very different and very interesting entry points into the question of literature and gender. Woolf's text, which I will discuss in some detail if I have time. Woolf's text, which is about the white middle-class woman's entry into the domain called authorship, and especially as writers of fiction, and Alice Walker's text, which talks about the need to go beyond literature in the sense of the writing of fiction to looking at other forms of creativity, like quilt making, like gardening, like other forms of collective, which would create a very, very different idea of creativity than the one which is produced by Woolf. This image, A Room of One's Own, I liked very much because these are two covers of two different two books. The text is the same, A Room of One's Own, but I loved the way in which representation of what constitutes a room is so different between the left and the right. Typically, on the left, you would find an image which would hark back to a period which is, impressionistic, or maybe a little like Modigliani. On the right, we have an image also of a room, which is very interestingly, which has a flower, a moon or a sun, sort of a kind of comfortable chair, and the pen, whose shadow is cast on the wall. This is not how you would imagine a realist room, but this is an abstraction of the idea of the room, which I found very interesting. Now, the reason why I chose A Room of One's Own to discuss, also because I understand that this is a text which is part of the CBCS syllabus, and I think more than that, it is a very, very important text about the questions of gender and literature, and the sort of, especially in the context of the past and the present, that this conference is trying to address. So Room of One's Own is actually published in 1929. I used 1928 as the series of lectures, which was given at Newnham and Girton. And I read it as an instance of her story in multiple senses. Multiple senses in terms of its content, and also the manner in which Woolf is writing. It is a feminist inquiry into why and how women write or cannot write. right? So it situates women in what we would call writers in historicity or her storicizing, if you may wish to use the word. Those of you who've read A Room of One's Own carefully will know it is a witty, playful, ironical, and funny feminist narrative. It's angry also at various points, and it lays the template for feminist literary criticism and theory. So Kate Millett, who I spoke about, or Elaine Showalter, also who I spoke about, the two forms of entry of gender and literature, or relation of gender and literature, of feminist readings by male authors and reading by women. These, if you think of these as the two dominant modes that have still sort of, which are still part of what we would call our understandings of the way in which literature and gender are related to one another, I would say A Room of One's Own is in that sense an originary text. It is a text to which we can trace many of the ideas, the origin of many of these feminist ideas about gender and literature. So, of course, this is most famous. It is very well known that Woolf begins playfully and dramatically by saying that if you have to write fiction, you need to have a room of one's own, you need to have a room of your own, and pound 500 a year. Now, this has been variously interpreted. One could think of it literally. One could also think of it metaphorically. So the room is a real room. The room is also a metaphor for a space in which women can inhabit without constant disruptions. You remember the story of Jane Austen, who wrote in the living room, and she would sort of, push away her writing into the roll-top desk as soon as people walked in. So to be able to work uninterrupted, to be able to write without, without the burden, let us say, of domesticity, to be able to write with a degree of autonomy and agency. For these things, Woolf would suggest that we need to have the privilege, one might say, of a legacy which is left, very interestingly, by a wealthy aunt, as opposed to the Jane Eyre story in which Jane inherits money from her uncle. Woolf is suggesting it is important, perhaps, to remember that we've also had mothers and aunts. We think back through our mothers. So I think it is a very important positioning of the relationship between gender and the act of writing or the production of literature, or even the consumption or the reading of literature, if we think about what Woolf is saying in less literal terms, right? So literal as well as more metaphorical. So the private space and private money, which would free the woman from the burdens that they have to often undergo. So I would suggest that leisure need not necessarily become the favorite, whipping tool for Woolf. I think it's very important, in spite of its class connotations. It has a very important feminist edge because it moves into a transgressive, non-feminine vocation of writing. Right. So by the time Woolf is writing, women writing is almost 200 years old, almost, let us say, or at least 150 years old. But it is still not an act which is associated with women. There is always the apology of the male pseudonym, as in the case of George Eliot, one of the most important, powerful writers of our times, or an idea that, or a constant reiteration and apologies that, oh, well, I'm just a woman who's writing. Okay, so even in Woolf's time, I think we're looking at, and that's 1928, in which some of the most remarkable writings have begun to happen or have happened. So Woolf's inquiry in the first two chapters, I would say, is a materialist account of women's exclusion. The fact that women are not allowed to go to the universities, or the fact that there is no fellowship, no money for women when they want to study, or when they want to pursue a life of autonomy and a little bit of leisure, which is necessary for scholarship. The second chapter is really one of the most brilliant chapters that Woolf is writing. It is about the narrator going to the British Museum, if you remember, and looking for women in poverty. And over there, she creates this fantastic caricature of Professor Von X. Von X, who is writing about the mental and the moral inferiority of women. So this is, I think, a fantastic jab at philosophical and psychoanalytic account of the construction of women and feminine. What Woolf is saying, and since philosophy was an important point of entry in the keynote, I would like to say that Virginia Woolf, who is no philosopher but has read a lot of philosophy and has published Freud's works, translation of Freud's works in the Hobart Press, is a woman who has great insight into both philosophy and psychoanalysis and the way in which they intersect. So what she's suggesting is that Professor Von X, who's written about the moral and mental and moral inferiority of women, is probably a deeply troubled man. Is a man who was probably laughed at by a beautiful woman in a cradle, and she's talking about castration, or probably whose wife ran away with a handsome cavalry officer. So she's probably also thinking about Anna Karenina. So with all of this, she's making a very, very important observation. What is the function of woman? The function of woman is to serve as a mirror which enlarges the ego of man. Right. So this here, we using the image of the mirror, right, which many years later Lacan is going to talk about in a very different way. But the act of mirroring, which we think of as faithful, is here turned into something which is the role of the feminine as given to her by patriarchy. So the function of woman is to pamper, is to enlarge the ego of man. If she fails to do so, then she damages the man, damages the male in such a way that he then acquires the authority to pronounce on women. Now, I think this is one of the most brilliant relationships between the self and the other that has ever happened in any kind of writing. From thence onwards, Right. Chapter 3, which is famously called Shakespeare's Sister. Incidentally, there's a journal which is called Shakespeare's Sister, which is about the fictional life of Judith Shakespeare. Now, there is no Judith Shakespeare, right? And Woolf knows it. So what is she doing? She's doing, I think, a remarkable her story, where she's saying that the archives of patriarchy will never contain the story of a talented sister called Judith, if she were to exist as William Shakespeare's sister. Why? Because however talented she was, however ambitious she was, however much she wanted to go to London and write a play, her biological destiny or her sexed identity is such that it would necessarily delimit herself to becoming the mistress of the manager of the playhouse, and she would find herself pregnant. And this is a fantastic line that Woolf writes. So who shall measure the heat and violence of a poet's heart when caught and tangled in a woman's body? So the poet's heart and the woman's body, these two become the irreconcilables, which create the tragic fate of Judith Shakespeare. So Woolf is suggesting that we have to go back to fiction, because fiction carries more truth than facts. So between fiction and fact, as Rabindranath would say, between Shwati and Aroshwati, right? So Woolf is positioning herself in the category of truth, Aroshwati, by going to something like fiction, because she's a fiction writer herself, that she can create this wonderful but very sad, very tragic story of Judith Shakespeare. And she suggests that any woman who was talented in the 16th century would find herself being treated like a witch, find herself being marginalized, find herself being whipped, or in some position where patriarchy could control her. So biology, let us say, in the 16th and 17th century is a woman's destiny, right? Chapter 4, which I find very, very interesting in terms of what is going to later be called gynocriticism. So Woolf is doing for the first time a complete what she knows as complete account of women writers from the 16th, 17th century, the daughters of Newcastle, to her contemporary times. And in this entire trajectory, she finds Aphra-Behn absolutely remarkable, Jane Austen too remarkable, because she is distant, she is ironic, and she can write without her gender in her head. And the person she whips in a major way is Charlotte Bronte. And because she says, in Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte is writing in anger, where she should be writing in a certain kind of detached manner. Now, Jane Eyre, as I said, has become an iconic feminist text. But Virginia Woolf seems to think that it is a flawed piece of writing. And this is interesting, it is important, because she's already planting over here the fact that what we call gender, as it's linked to biology, is something from which we need to get away. This is the beginning, I would say, of her famous theory of androgyny, which she suggests is a significant and very important category for the writer, any writer, man or woman, to have. Very quickly, chapter 5 is about Mary Carmichael, also a fiction, and a woman not of the past, but of her present, so a contemporary writer. And she's probably thinking of herself when she's writing about Mary Carmichael. What does Mary Carmichael write? She writes a text called Life's Adventure. And she writes in a way which breaks the rhythm, the syntax of the English language, the man-made language, right? So it's like bobbing up and down on a wave, right? The stream of consciousness, if you will. And she writes not about relationships which are heterosexual, but she talks about Chloe who loves Olivia. So Chloe and Olivia are typically names from classical past, but here they become comrades, they become co-workers in a laboratory. So she's thinking about the woman as a professional, she's thinking about the woman as a scientist, and she's thinking also of lesbian relationships. So we've moved away from the domain of largely romances which are heterosexual to a different kind of a possibility of romance. And you have to remember that this is also the time of Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness, which was tried for obscenity. It is usually regarded as the first lesbian text. It is not. It is a queer text, I would argue, in which the protagonist is brought up as a man and keeps falling in love with women. Woolf was called for the trial, this obscenity trial. She went. She testified that it was not an obscene text, but she was also socially very, very awkward, because Woolf herself, in her life, in her writings, Orlando, which was brought up yesterday in some discussion, is clearly moving towards what we may call the queer pitch. And then finally, I think we are looking at chapter 6, which is a real twist to the narrative, where she's going away from biological sex gender to suggest that gender of the writer, which is like a philosophical and radical category, suggesting that the ideal author should have both the male and the female, the man womanly and the woman manly in her or in him. So the androgynous mind that Coleridge talks about, the man womanly, the woman manly. This is the image of the androgyny, which you remember is a very, very interesting figure in many of Shakespeare's early comedies and middle comedies, right? The androgynous, the boy-girl figure. Now, Woolf is not interested in what we would say the hermaphrodite. No, she's not interested in actual bisexed categories. She's saying that this is a category which has to exist in the mind. In our minds, we cannot write only as men, nor can we write only as women. If we end up writing only as women, we will write in anger, like Charlotte Bronte. If we write only as men, we would end up becoming like Galsworthy, or we would end up becoming like Shelley, who is an ineffectual angel, she says, fluttering his wings. So what is your ideal? The ideal is William Shakespeare. Or maybe you could say Judith Shakespeare, who never was. So that is the androgynous mind, the mind which is incandescent, which is like a light. So that incandescent mind, Woolf suggests, and she's been hugely criticized for this, She's saying that this is not the mind of a man, this is not the mind of a woman, but this is the mind which would be able to, in some sense, overcome the constraints of this biological sex gender with which we are born. So feminists have actually become very angry with Woolf for saying all of this, because she follows a trajectory up to chapter 5, which is a very nice trajectory, a trajectory of women's exclusion, women's marginalization, and then suddenly she makes this twist. And she does this because she's this fantastic sort of maverick person, and she's a writer of fiction. And she says that you have to write like a man womanly or a woman manly, or else your art is going to be flawed. And here I think Woolf is talking like a modernist, in the sense that Eliot would say that we need to have be able to write with the entire classical past in our blood, in our veins, if we have to become the truly talented artists. So tradition and the individual talent and a room of one's own are in some senses texts which can be read together. But a room of one's own brings in the question of gender in ways that none of the male writers, no one who's writing in her time and maybe beyond her time, does. So I would like to end here. I think I may have used up more than my time, but this is what I wanted to share with you. Ideally, I would have also liked to discuss Alice Walker's In Search of Her Mother's Garden, but I don't think that's possible today. We might have an informal discussion if there is time, some other day and some other evening. So this is where I would like to end my discussion of literature and gender, suggesting that it is a very complex, very nuanced thing which is happening already in 1928. We have entered 2021, and we are still exploring the implications of what these complex negotiations between literature and gender can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ganguly. It was such an enlightening session, an experience for all of us, and I'm sure the students have been enriched.
You're muted. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Dr. Ganguly, for. I think I'm audible now.
Yes, you're audible now.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ganguly, for such an enlightening session. I'm sure it was of much help to the students as well. Thank you so much. Now, moving forward to our next segment, we have some of our students presenting papers from both the colleges. Our very first speaker is Zareen Haider from Lady Brabourne College, and her paper has been written in collaboration with Anushka Roy and Shemunti Manna, Lady Brabourne College. Zareen Haider.
I hope I'm audible to everyone.
Yes, you are.
Good evening, everyone. Today, our paper is titled Agatha Christie's Detective Fiction, A Gender Perspective. My collaborator, Shemunti Manna, will be sharing her screen for the slides. The First World War had brought about a marked social change in Europe, with women taking up various jobs as the men served on the front. After the war, women's position in society had already changed. The modern woman did not recede back into the environment of our home. In this context, Agatha Christie's works have often been criticized for not being completely modern or completely feminist, or being merely works of sensational detective fiction. The aim of our paper is to explore how Agatha Christie challenges gender roles even within the seemingly conventional presentation of class and society. When Agatha Christie's first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, was published, she already had the training and experience of a dispenser and an apothecary, which she was to use in this detective novel and in many more to come. The failure of her first marriage had pushed her and her daughter into a situation of financial insecurity, due to which she was forced to take up the to take up writing as a permanent career. Neither her second marriage nor her eventual financial security would make Christie quit her flourishing career. And even though in her first marriage she had considered her primary role to be that of a homemaker, her artistic leanings to only be a hobby, Christie was, in spite of herself, a career woman. Although in her novels she does not offer an ostensibly feminist portrayal of her characters per se, and in her life she did not engage in or show open support to the suffragette movement, her fictional characters are depicted with nuance. Detective fiction, although a well-known and widely consumed genre, had usually concerned itself with intensely masculine characters such as Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. These famous detectives made use of high intellect rather than intuition. Stephen Knight points out that the heroic nature of Holmes, his preserving bourgeois morality, his restoring order to the society, his aloofness, and ultimately his resurrection from death has granted him the status of almost a mythical hero like that of King Arthur or Robin Hood. And while Christie's detectives like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple surely do restore order in society, they are not conventionally heroic. Critics of Agatha Christie all seem to agree, at least on one point, that her conservatism is prominent in her writing. She makes use of the tried and tested methods of detective fiction, and she represents the bourgeoisie. The detective exposes the culprit causing disharmony. All marriageable characters find suitable partners in the end, and overall order is restored. What Christie is innovative in is her treatment of her detectives. Hercule Poirot is very unlike his predecessors. Besides being a foreigner, he is very eccentric. As Marja Mackinnon has pointed out, with his meticulous clothes and patent leather shoes, he is anything but a heroic figure. He keeps obsessing over his appearance, remains actively concerned with his clothes, and picky about his culinary habits. As a matter of fact, even his name acts as a reminder about his unmacho personality. The gallant Hercules is reduced to a buffoon in Christie's near-parodic representation of the unmasculine detective. Sherlock Holmes reaches the position of a near-mythical hero through his creator's portrayal. With Poirot's explicit attention to neatness, he stands in stark contrast to Holmes's life of disorder and disarray. There is a clear distinction between their ways of detection, with Holmes's excessive attention to detail as opposed to Poirot's fondness of studying the psychology of criminals. There is a detachment and a lack of empathy in Holmes's investigation, which again clashes with Poirot's attachment and emotive connections that he builds with the characters around him, especially with the women. However, this unusual depiction does not quite transform him into an unambiguously feminine figure. An extensive knowledge of feminine household objects like a starched handkerchief or a nail polish do not make him feminine, just meticulous. As critics like Cora Kaplan describe, this portrayal of Poirot by Christie is, at worst, explicitly anti-feminist and at best, highly ambivalent without any disruption of traditional gender relations. However, all these accusations at Christie's despite all the accusations of Christie's conservatism, there is a subtle resistance to the traditional patriarchy in her detective's portrayal. As Shaw and Wanneker write, are not Poirot and his ilk very like women themselves, apparently trivial, but actually the ones who put the pattern together, who restore order to a shaken world. Dorothy L. Sears had commented in her introduction to the Omnibus of Crime that in the past, female detectives were usually presented to be either irritatingly intuitive or insistent upon walking into physical danger, besides being undoubtedly young and beautiful. In this stereotypical representation of women, of female detectives, in a largely male-dominated field, Christie introduces a septuagenarian sleuth, Miss Jane Marple. Agatha Christie's creation of Miss Marple poses a challenge to various patriarchal stereotypes that were attached to the image of the spinster or the divorced woman. In the aftermath of the First World War, surplus women were seen as threatening to the social fabric of the time, but as Jill Plain points out, Christie did not play to this antagonizing stereotype. Christie utilizes the spinster's potential as both a fearsome oddity and a moral force. Unlike Hercule Poirot, who is an outsider and who plays on his foreignness, Miss Marple lies in direct contrast because she is placed right in the heart of the village life. She is very much a part of the community, although marginalized by the phallocentric society around her. Her appearance is often thought, Miss Marple is often thought of as physically and mentally weak, Her fluffy appearance gives her a harmless enough look which camouflages her intentions as she goes investigating. And by the end of the stories, the readers are acquainted with her skills. In many of the novels, witnesses and suspects find it much easier to talk to her as opposed to being interrogated at a police station. Thus, she manages to wring out information from places where one least expects to find it. The two most common stereotypes that Miss Marple knocks down are about her age and about gossip. Old women are often thought to be unworldly and anachronistic, gossipy and interfering. She is often referred to as a nosy old cat or a scandalmonger, but she uses these stereotypes to her advantage. As Marja Mackinnon points out, people may be bored by an old lady's rambling conversation, but they don't suspect her of an ulterior motive. It is her success in playing the expected spinster role which enables her to gather needed information. Christie deliberately draws attention of the readers to Marple's old age by making her ponder about how she might be too old for any more adventures, but in the very next moment, as she discovers the clue, she does not feel tired at all. Men in acceptable positions of power in many of the novels denigrate women and their gossip. Often in these novels, we find men like the Vicar, the constables, the doctors, all in positions of power. And then comes Miss Jane Marple, who encroaches upon their territory by making a space for herself. She terms her skills not as female intuition, but rather a specialized knowledge. Miss Marple, as main detective, is in control of the complete process of investigation, both the initial feminine disquiet and the masculine explanation of facts, which is in contrast to earlier female detectives. In Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, Lady Molly is not only described as charming, graceful, and elegant, but also someone who is very intuitive and very impulsive. She is unable to account for her actions logically, unlike Miss Jane Marple, who always gives a logical reasoning in the end. Finally, with respect to deviancy, there is a very overt conflict in Christie's works with the traditional viewing of female criminals that can be observed. For instance, the act of murder itself was considered a very unfeminine function, one that required virility and a certain calmness of mind that had been the sole claim of men. So when a woman did end up committing murder, she was represented in binary. Either she was excessively demonized because she had dared to go against the natural norm, thus becoming an unnatural woman, or the blame was shifted from her on grounds that she had been in some way taken over by her emotions. Christie's texts very clearly renounce this othering of female delinquency and instead represent it as at least as naturally as male corruption. There is a matter-of-fact acceptance of women as murderers in a way that refuses to either demonize them for their rejection of gender stereotypes or to negate their agency and thus their power to disrupt society. Although criticism for depicting only upper-class conservative society has been leveled against Christie, it is important to note that even in the section that she portrays, yes ma'am, I will just wrap up, her characterization is varied and nuanced. In conclusion, both her detectives and her villains challenge gender roles and subvert behavior that is expected of their sex. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zareen. Our next paper presenter is from Vijay Krishna Girls College. Ishani Das. This paper has also been written in collaboration by Raima Chatterjee and Shalini Das from Vijay Krishna Girls College. So I would request Ishani Das to take over.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, I want to thank all of my respected teachers for arranging such a beautiful seminar. I am Ishani Das, and today I am going to talk about gender issues in our literature. Literature is a group of artistic work of art made of words. It is truly said that literature is a reflection of the contemporary society. It presents the vices and the follies of the society through a highly symbolic delivery. Literature captures the modern problems of our society. One of the raging problems of the modern world is gender bias. Gender, through the eyes of literature, can depict gender as a pattern constructed in society, which in turn influences our views of ourselves. When we read or write, we do so as gendered individuals, as people who have been taught that there are values assigned to the sexes. So we may no longer believe that male is equal to power and authority and female is equal to passivity and comprise. Hence, in a piece of writing, gender can be seen as a social category with the influence of stereotypes of male and female behavior that exist in society, which again are culturally produced or constructed. Our area of discussion today is the works of Vijay Tendulkar. The themes of his writings are gender issues, violence, and power politics. His women characters, Vinare, Rama, Mitra, Sharita, Kamala, Lakshmi, Champa, and Manik, are no doubt rebel against the existing norms of the society. Vijay Tendulkar's play Silence the Court-Asian Session is one of the best examples of the kind of gender bias which women in Indian society face. Silence the Court-Asian Session presents a play within a play where Vinare, as the accused, is tried for an imaginary crime of infanticide. Though the trial is conducted in game-like non-serious manner, it exposes the past life of Vinare and authenticates the feeling of superiority of men over women in Indian society. This play deals with the mental state of an educated woman in a traditionally male-dominated Indian society. The so-called social workers like Mr. Kashikar and his troupe show social concern for social reform, and Tendulkar attacked them ironically and satirically throughout the play. Tendulkar exposes the condition of the women of the middle class in Indian context. Both Binare and Ms. Kashikar are represented as women who have fallen victims to male supremacy in Indian society. They both are not free to act independently. Binare's attempt to lead an independent life of her own has been frustrated by the group of men surrounding her during the course of mock trial. Binare's self-confession is one of the main part of the play. Man is the last analysis and prone to error. Youth leads a person astray. Let the terrible crime that the accused has committed and is committing be regarded with much mercy. However, Binare admits all her crimes. She refers to her love affair with her maternal uncle and Professor Tumble. But both men had deceived her. Binare's agony brings to the fore the real person behind her roles. The isolated young woman yet to come to terms with her disturbed life, her conflicting feelings and realizations. Binare willingly accepts, cherishes, and upholds the sex role of motherhood. The play wins the ground as a social satire. Through the game, the dramatist draws the attention to some vital social issues. The trial brings to the light the contradictions and complexities in the life and nature of both the victimizers and the victim. Each character reaches a point where his or her social mass is set. The mock trial, a theatre in the making, reaches its climax. The climax is the collapse of Villa Binare. The incident of suppressing women is not a new matter at all. The pages of history had many instances of the brutal power of patriarchy. The subjugations and dominances over women get a voice of protest through the literature. In the modern world, independent women like Leela Binare is suffering only for the meaningless patriarchal rules. These literary figures represent the huge gender gap of our society even today. In the conclusion, we can say that women don't need any sympathy or company. They need a free space where they can fly safely. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ishani. Our next paper presenter is Ananya Mitra from Lady Brabourne College. This paper has been written in collaboration with Abheri Bhattacharya and Sushmita Bhattacharya. Ananya Mitra.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, one and all present here. Our paper generally focuses on the gender issues in children's rhymes, and I hope it will be relatable to all because at some point, mainly in childhood, we've all come across these rhymes, and I'll take each and one from across the culture and we'll discuss a bit about it. Uh, as an existentialist, Simone de Beauvoir believed that existence precedes essence, hence one is not born but rather becomes a woman. Her opening statement in the second sex precisely sums up how the paralyzed traditions and customs frame a quote-unquote a female into the acceptable version of the feminine. Gender as a part of the social discourse requires the everyday reception, acceptance, performance, and certain hegemonic practices, behavior, rituals, and actions. The Gramscian concept of hegemony fixes the normal and the degrees of freedom one has in performing one's gender is similar to the quote-unquote trick that Althusser terms as interpellation, whereby we made to feel that we are choosing when actually we have no choice. And I'm quoting an example by Althusser. He says that one is free to choose a pen as long as it's black. It is necessary to clarify the word patriarchy is not associated with males only. According to bell hooks, patriarchy is just another name for the institutionalized sexism, and but both gender can be participants in perpetuating this sexism. Similarly, Helen Sixes coined the term écriture féminine in her book, The Laugh of Medusa, which literally means feminine writing. She argues that it does not belong exclusively to the females, and the male can also occupy the marginalized position of the women within the symbolic and write in écriture féminine from that position. So nursery rhymes have played a subtle role in conditioning the blank canvas of the infant's mind to such normative gender performances. The simple rhyme, the old woman in the shoe, subscribed to the fact that women are miserable without the support of the superior masculine figure. The fact that she did not know what to do depicts the inability of the women to take vital economic decisions, thereby excluding women from the public sphere of men. The rhyme, titled Sing Lullaby, strengthens this bias, assuring the child that Papa is going to buy mockingbird, diamond ring, looking glass, because it is he who can earn money while mummy will tend to the household chores. The concept of private-public dichotomy is also evident. While males get the identity of producers in the public domain, the task of reproduction is assigned to women in the private domain. The body of the female becomes the male's property, and to quote Engels, she became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of his children. In a funny rhythmic tone, when the man in the Bachelor's Lament desires a wife for cleaning his household, he is essentially perceiving himself as the master and wife as a domestic slave. Such labor, which is believed to be derogatory for men and appropriate for women, goes unpaid. In this context, the adequacy of Marxism was highly questioned by Marxist feminists, since it narrows down the concept to food and commodities alone. The behavioral differences between boys and girls continue to be the center of discussion of these famous rhyme, "What are little boys and girls made of?" And it goes, "Puppy dog's tails, that's what little boys are made of. Sugar and spice and all things nice, that's what the little girls are made of." The inherent idea is to compartmentalize the male and the female domain. There is also a suggestion of how the two genders are perceived by the society. While boys are thought to be intellectually stronger, girls are seen as delicate and charming. Stemming from such belief is the practice of providing boys with cars and robot models to play with and girls with red-cheeked dolls. The segregation of space goes so far as to assign colors that are thought proper for each gender. Blue for boys and pink for girls. Even to this day, we've categorized economic sectors based on colors, as if the blue-collar workers who perform the hard labors as compared to the pink-collar workers who constitute the waitresses, the elementary school teachers, and secretaries, are often considered as inferior to the jobs that what the blue collars perform. The conventional idea of the fussy woman is found in an Urdu rhyme as well. The rhyme, Tot Batot, shows a man struck between the strangehold of two women in his life. And the rhyme goes, Khatam hui sari azadi, Tot Batot ne kar li shadi. His sister comes forth as a peculiar because she is not what the society visualizes a woman to be, possessing the amiable qualities of docility and obedience. On the other hand, his wife transgresses the rigid boundaries of patriarchy and has denied to be the ideal wife. The poem also has a second station of gender issue. Tot Batot is a man whose distress is even more because he is mocked and humiliated by the female figures who are often considered as the inferior or the second sex. Thus, both the sexes, a point to be noted, both the sexes here becomes the victim of ridicule if they deviate from the socially construed ideal. In the Bengali culture too, rhymes like Dol Dol Duluni put forth the impression that a girl's child's utmost fulfillment lies in getting married. In the rhyme, Chand Utheche Phul Futeche, Sonamoni is a girl child and her marriage seems to be the pinnacle of all that is nice and happy. A two-liner that goes, Chachi Puchi Khaye, Bor Shundor Hoy, once again reiterates the idea that everything good that a girl does is in the hope of a good, or rather a good-looking husband. The male, Khoka, is always seen in active roles enjoying his time. Khoka Jabe Mach Dhorte has a young boy venturing out to catch fish, and the companion in his journey is also a male cat or Hulo Beral. On the contrary, the rhyme Chi 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 Rani Radhe Shekheni has a girl failing miserably at cooking and thereby being mocked at. This underlines not only the expectations of society upon a girl child, but also how she is treated when she fails to meet those standards. Women have forever been idealized as the quote-unquote Lokhi of the household, from being the Lokhi me at childhood to the Lokhi Muntobo after marriage. If this early training is received from rhymes, the later training is received from household texts like Lokhi Pachali. The Pachali enlists all the needful duties of a woman and unconsciously become attuned to practicing the same in their lives. To qualify as the Griholokhi, the Bengali counterpart of the angel at home, Lokhi Pachali demands that women to show love and affection to her in-laws and obey her husband. Poti je Porom Guru Manena Tahari. The Pachali thus establishes a set of hegemonic rules for the Hindu wife, and any transgression or digression as viewed as quote-unquote kukormo, which is believed to bring misery to the family. In the guise of religious norms, what the Pachali naturally does is training the woman to subvert to patriarchy. A line in the Pachali goes, Lojja adi gun joto narir bhushon. This underlines the male expectation of the shy and timid woman who will hide her under veil. It comes as a shock how the Thakur Ghar, the identified place for seeking strength, harbors such misogynistic ideals. As Woolf argues in her lecture that it is important for women to have a space free from gender stereotypes, and she calls for a room of one's own, but the Thakur Ghar, where she sits and recites the Pachali, and which society views as a feminine space, binds her more than ever to the pathetic ideal of womanhood. That she is required to recite the Pachali every week serves as a kind of reminder from herself to herself of the woman she ought to become, lest the society shuns her as Olokhi. The problem with such another text is that they have become such integral part of the household that it becomes extremely difficult to look beyond its blindfold. The sexist ideas buried deep into the nursery rhymes have become as normalized with ages of recitation and repetition as the habit of saving the biggest piece of fish for the male in the household. For any change to occur, what the society needs first and foremost is to spark a conversation, and how slow it may, but the conversation has begun. Kamala Bhasin, an Indian feminist writer, presents the reality of gender identity in a nursery rhyme, if not erase them altogether. Her poem entitled Mother goes, Mother works away all day, through the week and all Sunday. She always has something to do. She always has some tasks in view, she bears the burden of all. The child hence learns that housework is everyone's work, therefore it evokes an equal respect for the mother in the child's heart. And we, as social animals, have drawn a thick line between this male and the female. It reminds me of, to quote from the Tani's play, A Dance Like a Man, where a character says that a woman in a man's world is progressive, but a man in a woman's world is pathetic. Uh, it is perhaps too early to expect role reversals taking place in children's rhymes and for a radical departure from compulsory normativity. The young minds will perhaps have to wait a few more years before they can see their princess rescuing her prince charming instead of being always the other way round. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ananya. Our very last student speaker is Preetha Ray from Vijay Krishna Girls College. And this paper has also been written in collaboration. The other writers or contributors are Shayani Sen and Shromo Naman. The speaker is Preetha Ray.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible? Ma'am,
Yes,
am I
yes.
audible?
Yes, yes.
Good evening to one and all present here. My topic for today is gender discrimination in literature, with a special reference to Rashtrasundari Devi's autobiography, Amar Jeevan. Gender discrimination in literature is still considered to be one of the most debatable topics among the artists 100 years back, forward, or even in the present. The problem with this issue is that it prescribes how we should be rather than recognizing how we are. We humans have evolved, but even today it seems that the idea of gender has not. The impact of gender discrimination is not just found in society at large, but also a big share of it is reflected in literature. The question that majorly follows a female artist is, what is it like being a female artist? We females have a sordid history. In 1956, when a Sahitya Award winner gets asked if she is only popular because of her beauty and paraphernalia. 100 years before Amrita Pritam in the land of beauty, bounty, and freedom, in 1859, the Bronte sisters in England began to publish their writing under a male pseudonym because their writing wasn't what we considered feminine. Even if we fast forward it to 2021, female artists are still considered to be more female and less artist. Our biology is under scrutiny, and it is no less than a mutiny. That 100 years forward or behind, we're still asking people to change their mind. We ask people to look at art with heart and make sure they understand art has no gender and neither do artists. In the history of English literature, the world has witnessed some of the most dynamic women who were audacious enough to speak against injustice faced by them. Fight against gender discrimination over the years, on and off in literature, has been predominantly a women's movement by female writers who crave for the survival for their identity, emotions, and independence. Turning the pages of literature, we would like to specifically highlight on Rashtrasundari Devi's autobiography, Amar Jeevan, to bring out the gender issues that has been vividly reflected in her writing. Literature is not just the mirror of the society, but also the mirror of an individual soul. Her autobiography reflects her painstaking suffering in a stereotypical society and a fight to live up her dreams despite being crushed down by gender-biased environments. It reflects a candid confessional tone of all autobiographies. It is unique in being manifested, combining elements of protest, scathing satire, objective documents of facts, resentment against discriminatory social institutions, and the outpouring of devotional fervor. The significance lies in the vivid recording of the struggle against insurmountable hurdles to be a self-taught woman in the 19th century Orthodox Indian patriarchal society that denied and forbidden literacy to women. It also contains some of the feminist thoughts to be clearly voiced in the Indian literature later on. It is also an unwittingly made protest against patriarchy. Rashundari Devi's desire not to remain as an unlettered woman throughout her life also led the urge of connecting to people and read variety of texts. She, by penning down her autobiography, could gain an identity for herself, independent of her husband and children. She becomes a strong advocate of women's right to education, and she expresses her joy in seeing the changing times where parents consider educating their girl children. Her autobiography is not only a chronicle of dedication, hard work, and devotion towards learning, but also a self-discovery and quest for identity. In the society of the 21st century, such discrimination prevails in a different outlook. Even in today's world, class matters. Women's decision to go back to work may be different for different classes, with working class women more likely to work because they need the money. Patterns for childcare choices are also class related, with lower social groups are more likely to rely on relatives, while professional and managerial parents choose to more expensive market-based care. Even the ability to work and achieve a balanced life has a significant social class, as well as gender dimension. However, women continue to face discrimination and other types of harm because of their gender. And it remains imperative that we ask ourselves what we can do to eradicate violence against women and ensure that women have equal rights and power in society. These issues are the heart of feminism and feminist ethics. So let's sow a sort of equality in our soil and see the plant of equality grow. The change would start with an individual. When we stop differentiating between colors and toys, household responsibilities, and career, only then the mindset of society can change. We are society, and when we change our thoughts, our country will enjoy the freedom of equality. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Preetha. It feels wonderful when students present paper. Thank you for all the students for participating. Our next segment, we have our esteemed professors who would be presenting their papers. Our very first speaker is Dr. Madhumita Barua, Assistant Professor, Lady Brabourne College. Dr. Madhumita Barua. Ma'am, are you here?
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Yes. I just need a moment to present my screen, actually.
Sure.
Yes. I should thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present the paper. As you can see the screen, I hope all can see the screen. The title of my paper is The New Woman and the Turn of the Century Lady Detective. It is a truism that detective fiction, unlike the mystery story, could not have been conceived until the real-life detectives demonstrated the role. So is it true that the advent of the fictional female detective depended much on the social conditions and changes which allowed authors and readers to imagine women protagonists in this position. Historian Eric Hobsbawm notes that though women's emancipation in the last decades of the 19th century was confined to the middle and the statistically less significant upper strata of Victorian society, the impact within the bourgeois milieu was considerable enough, which led to the production of a novel species, the New Woman, who figured in male speculation and argument since 1880s. And who appeared as heroines or rather anti-heroines in the writings of progressive writers like Henrik Ibsen and Bernard Shaw. To attempt a simple definition of the New Woman would trivialize a rather complex phenomena. There is no single image or vision of this idea, which at once is a literary and a mass media construct, and also, to a certain extent, a social reality. The images that we are actually showing in this slide are mainly the constructs of the mass media and the literary images we find in the various new women novel and plays which were written during the Findicitum. Here you can see in the first slide a representation, a caricature of the New Woman as imagined by the popular press and published in the Spanish language version of the Punch. Sorry. Yes. Melvin Burger Woods mentions that naming of the New Woman emerged out of the well-known exchange between novelist Sarah Grant and Olga in the North American Review in 1894. And since then, the term gave credence to the growing feminist movement and mobilized its conservative critics. Literary critics and historians tend to categorize the New Woman as a literary invention who was featured in novels and plays of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, the early 19th and early 20th centuries. These depictions referencing independent women, women working outside the home, as well as women's suffrage, dress reform, advances in legal rights, increased educational opportunities, birth control, sexual and physical freedom, range from supportive to derogative of women's emancipation. The representation of liberated women in the New Woman novel got parodied in the popular press, further distorting the meaning of the identity as the potential symbol of women's liberation. These satirical representations of the New Woman in contemporary mainstream media bears little resemblance to their literary counterparts and encompasses all the fears of the Victorian society. And the fear and the general gender panic. In the hands of the popular press, she was transformed into an Amazon, a mannish brute, a third sex that was neither man nor woman, who wore trousers, who rode bicycles, smoked in public, and engaged in paid work outside the home. This New Woman engaged in male pursuits, threatened to replace the Victorian man in the workforce and turn the gender roles on its head. Here you see the New Woman with her bicycle, and here in this poem that I show in the slide, it is an anonymous poem published in the Home Chat, which is a slander and a kind of a depiction of the New Woman. Let me read out these few lines. Who cuts her back hair off quite short and puts on clothes she didn't ought and apes a man in word and thought. New Woman who rides a cycle around the town in costume making all men's frown and otherwise acts like a clown. New Woman who is sweetest to the sweet, I say, because she throws not sex away, is always ladylike, yet gay, true woman. So you can understand the kind of slander that is there in these kinds of popular press construct. And in this image, you can see that the women attired as the ancient Greek Amazons going to siege Troy, where men are left at home to look after the children. So And these are some caricatures which the mainstream popular press projected, and which actually encompass the Victorian society's fear of women's liberation and women's education and women's progress. Another picture which shows a man engaged in household chores, whereas the woman, giving instructions. So it is important to note that in the 1880s, while the intelligentsia of the West was engaged in inventing the new woman in novels and mass media, Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes series witnessed unparalleled success, which set a vogue for the scientific detective. Other possible avenues for the sake of variation were also explored, which eventually brought about the emergence of what may be called the turn-of-the-century lady detective. Catherine Gregory Klein observes that between 1891 and 1910, in about 12 detective novels, 5 female protagonists appear who either call themselves lady detective or simply detective. The impetus received, in this paper, I posit that apart from the impetus received from the Holmes series, the milieu created by the much discussed idea of the new woman in the intellectual circles, along with the innumerable representations in magazines and journals and fiction of strong and rebellious women characters engaged in professions and performing daring activities, allowed writers to imagine a woman in the role of a detective almost 20 years earlier than their first entry into the British police service. The figure of the lady detective, I construe, posed a veritable challenge to the ideals of Victorian femininity. Femininity and women's paid employment were contradiction in terms to Victorian ideas of gentility, where marriage was considered as the only preservative. However, for women. However, the immediate socio-economic changes of post-industrial society made paid work for women necessary. As Catherine Gregory Klein observes in this quotation, employment for women, the ladies, gentlewomen, daughters of educated men, was an economic necessity, not to be met by private governessing or fine sewing and needlework. There needs to be educated beyond drawing room accomplishments and domestic management to be self-sufficient and yet to remain socially accepted ladies were partially responsible for the magnitude of change in women's lives and roles in the last third of the 19th century. So with the necessity of employment for educated men's daughters was recognized, and opportunities for employment opened for unmarried women in England and for married women, things did not change until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 came into being. Which actually changed the situation of legal rights, property rights of the married women. But the greatest of all opportunities came to the middle-class English women through education. The most revolutionary event that brought about total change in the educational status of women was establishment of women's colleges in the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. So the emancipation of women promised through higher education and economic independence was countered by the defenders of conventional patriarchy. It was argued that education and employment entailed challenging and coarse activities that were beyond a woman's control and propriety. The desirability of the angel in the house, a physically fragile and delicate, morally pure, incorruptible and chaste woman, prevailed in popular consciousness. In spite of the many strategic attempts to check women's emancipation, women, mostly daughters of educated men, jointly created a climate and worked to liberate themselves from restricting social impositions. This, which might say, was the new woman in practice. And in this milieu, the popular press conceived the lady detective, which was a fantastic composite of this new image of the new woman. Earlier narratives of lady detectives, which were conceived in the 1870s, 1860s, were compounded with derision, compounded derision with skepticism. Whereas, in the later detectives of that I am talking about, who were conceived in 1890s, were a bit different from the early detectives because in their in their works activities also. Yet I would say they were I would not say that they were very, very strongly feminist characters, and the narratives were very, very feminist in the line feminist in nature, but still they were a kind of extension of the new woman fiction, these narratives. And from the handful of lady detectives which appear in the turn of the century, I have chosen 3 characters, as you can see in this slide. Lavade Brooke, who was created by Catherine Louisa Perkis in The Experiences of Lavade Brooke, Lady Detective in 1893. Dorcas Den, who was created by George Robert Sims in the Dorcas Den Detective. There were 2 volumes actually in 1987, in 1988, later on compounded together. And then Dora Maar, who was created by M. MacDonald Botkin in Dora Maar, Lady Detective. And also later there was another sequel novel, The Capture of Paul Beck. So I come to a very swiftly, I will go into a small brief discussion of the 3 ladies. As early as 1893, Catherine Louisa Perkis created Lavade Brooke, one of the earliest female detectives who rely more on analytical reasoning than impulse. Perkis's depiction of the detective protagonist is surely different in many ways. She is a paid professional and not an amateur sleuth. She is a loner without an assistant, and there is no Watsonian figure to narrate her tale, and to assist her. She is an older spinster, above 30. She is nondescript in appearance, unlike most male-female heroes. And this is very interesting because her nondescript appearance and her old age, she's not a very old age as Miss Marple, but she is an old spinster, you can say above 30. So not marriageable anymore. So this puts her in a particular position where she is doubly invisible. She is not acceptable in the marriage market because she is beyond the marriageable age, and her nondescript appearance is very deceptive because no one would actually assume that she is a detective. She uses Holmesian methods, analytical methods of careful observations. And she's unbiased by police observation. And she displays imaginative intelligence rooted in common sense. Yet, somehow, the narratives of the stories of Lavade Brooke, she is in many ways a strong, a depiction of the new woman, new liberated woman who is earning her bread by a very different kind of a masculine job. She is in a masculine job, so-called masculine job. But somehow, in the narratives we see that Catherine Louisa Perkis, is sabotaging sabotaging the narratives, sabotaging her success, as in her narratives, her action is subordinated to the male associates. Whenever she is not allowed to catch the criminal, she always needs a male associate to catch the criminal or to handle much more dangerous situations. I would in this connection, I would actually try to mention that in most of these narratives that were created during the turn of the centuries of early lady detectives, most of the lady detectives tended to abandon their detecting career in the middle of their career and actually marry, they were brought to the marital altar and they abandoned their detective career. So, and in most cases, these detectives came to the profession to exonerate a male relative. But Lavade is perhaps the only one who comes out of her own volition, not to exonerate a male relative. I come to the next section, who is the next character, who is Dorcas Den, who is another professional detective who earns her bread by detecting. She was created by George R. Sims. And her first appearance is in Dorcas Den Detective in 1897, followed by another collection in the next year. And the stories were told by the dramatist Mr. Saxon, who had earlier given, who is a dramatist and who had earlier given Dorcas chances on the stage. Now, but Dorcas is married to a blind artist, and she's married to a man, to an artist who is blinded later on, and therefore they fall to poverty, and she is compelled to come to detection with the help of professional Scotland Yard retired detective. Now, this the stories, in the stories, she is very confident. She's very upright. She's adept in disguises. She has the common sense. She has the perception and observation. Everything. She would make. She's comparable to any other kind of male detective. But this plot line is also undercut by another parallel plot line, which is another subplot, you can say. Often we see that her notions of femininity and apprehensiveness, which she expresses, and which clashes with the idea of the really formidable and famous and successful detective. And her presence in the narratives is undercut by the male presences, one of the narrator, Mr. Saxon, and another of the blind husband, Paul. And married to this blind artist, she is always trying to be the dutiful wife. She is always the womanly woman who works hard to persuade her husband of his masculine superiority despite his blindness. This woman is capable of abandoning her independence, her judgment, and her conclusions on demand. And the functions of both the detective as formulaic character and the protagonist as one of the novel's structuring elements are reduced in the novels, as Sims replaces them with the combined presence of the male team, narrator and husband. Dorcas Den, woman and detective, is submerged with the confines of patriarchal marriage. We come to the next slide, where we find Dora Mull, the lady detective, who was created by M. MacDonald Botkin. Here we find, in these narratives, once again, we find the romantic nostalgia for the conventional gender roles. But Dora Mull was otherwise initially created as a very, very interesting character. She was conceived initially in the light of the New Woman, as the author presents her as a Cambridge wrangler and also a doctor of medicine. She is mentally alert and commonsensical, and her deductions, and she's physically agile and active. She rides a bicycle and keeps firearms. You can see from the cover that she's riding a bicycle. And she had, before coming to the profession of detection, she has worked as a telegraph girl, telephone girl, lady journalist, because medical practice failed her. So Dora's choice of profession gives us a view of the kind of paid work women took up outside the more conventional positions as teachers and governesses. So you can see that here in Dora Mull's, the stories of Dora Mull, what I would like to concentrate on is that how this otherwise successful detective is undercut, the narrative of the detective is undercut by the subplot of marriage. she gradually, in the second, novel, the Capture of Paul Beck, her detective gradually succumbs to the marriage altar, and she gives up her career and assumes the womanly role of wife of mother in subsequent portrayals. And throughout the stories, what I observed is that, she had been described or referred to constantly as a girl, a slip of a girl, a little busybody, and described as dainty and ladylike. And, most of the time it seems that pleasure, not business, was her mission in the world. All of this emphasis serves to distract and deny the professional competence which the stories would seem to claim for her. Now, I would just like to wrap up because it is quite impossible to finish the paper in this manner, the entire paper in this manner, because I know we are short of time. Now, in conclusion, I must say that detective fiction, like popular fiction in general, follows rather than parallels social change. In this rather conservative genre, success of the story is structurally dependent on the regular and familiar sequence of events, and thematically on the reinforced capitalistic, traditional, moralistic, and nostalgic worldview. This brief survey of the turn of the century lady detectives showed that when authors introduced women detectives in the genre, their attention was divided between three lines: adherence to the demands of the genre, depiction of the changing social scene through portrayal of the new woman playing unconventional roles, and above all, popular demand of the reading public, which still held on to the traditional ideas of gender roles in society. In these narratives, readers are entertained and reassured by fantasies which encapsulate fictionally the world as it never was. Competing with the apparently dominant detection plot is a powerful subplot showing women their rightful position in society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. for such an interesting paper. Before moving on to the next speaker, I would like to inform that if you have any questions, please share it in the chat box. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Sarkar, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Midnapur College. Dr. Sarkar.
Okay. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I know that I'm a little pressed for time, but I must have at least a moment to thank the organizers for the opportunity, and especially Suva. Good evening to all of you. It has been a lovely session up until now. And as I have been requested by the organizers to confine my presentation within 10 minutes, I'll try to do that. And I'll try to keep my presentation to few simple points. But for that, let me present my screen. Just allow me 10 or so seconds. Just a moment. Okay. Is this visible to you, or it is getting visible? Right? Can you see this?
Yes, it's visible.
Thank you so much.
It is.
So the topic of my presentation today is science fiction as it is being written in India, particularly Anglophone Indians, and even more particularly Indian women science fiction writers. I would begin with something that, or a text that our invited speakers, Professor Ganguly had mentioned, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And you know that it has been called the very first instance of science fictional text. It was written back in 1818, though technically it would be better to call it a proto-science fiction, not a very proper science fiction, but 1818, and this is 2021, more than 200 years have gone by. Though the first science fiction text was written by a woman, Lisa Yazek, I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Yazek, she is an assistant professor. She's a professor of science fiction, which is a delightful thing, at Georgia Tech University, and is a writer of books like Sisters for Tomorrow and Future is Female. She has mentioned, after doing a survey, that among the writers who write science fiction, only 15% is female. Only 15. And she says that if you take into account the pulp magazines, the fantasy stuff, then maybe the percentage is going to go a little high up, but not by much, right? So today, what I'm trying to do is to say that these are the definitions, and I'm kind of skipping over one definition which is very relevant and it's very basic. This is by Darko Sovin, who talks about three very important aspects of science fictional writing, that is estrangement and cognition and alternative. So estrangement is something that is to be there, that it has to be different from what we have now, but then it has to be understood within the cognitive framework that of today, so that it becomes relatable for us, though it is situated somewhere distant, temporarily maybe, most likely, because temporal projection into the future is something that is very common in science fiction, and also that it has to be highly alternative to the world that we live in. Sovin also had proposed that it has to have a novum, which means it has to be something new. Now, my point is that science fiction is traditionally thought to be a very masculine field, because science is something that you do out in the world. And you know very well that how the patriarchal system has very conveniently divided our world into the public and the private sphere, the public sphere being the sphere of the men and the private sphere being the sphere of the women. So the domestic sphere, there you do not do science, but you do science outside. So science and science fiction writing both have been very masculine, and they focus on science and technology and almost quote unquote naturally exclude women. They have women characters, but mostly they are either damsels in distress or a femme fatale or someone who is maybe intuitively solving problem, but not rational enough to understand what she's doing, right? So this is an area that has to be mapped, but science fiction in India is a genre that has not been under the critical light that it deserves, right? I have here quoted, and this is a longish quotation by Hans Harder, and he has said this about Marathi science fiction, but this kind of applies to science fiction written in India more or less holistically, whether it written in vernacular languages or in the English language. He talks about the Vijnana science binary, as in Dharma religion binary, Darshana philosophy binary. Vijnana is science, but if you just utter the word Vijnan, it is something a bit semantically different from the word science, as if it carries a bit of a pre-colonial memory, pre-colonial knowledge of the kind of science that we used to do. So Vijnana is something that kind of takes us back to a world that was existent before the arrival of the colonizers. Now, this is one more important point, is that for the Indian context, or in the Indian context, science, as we understand it, as the modern science, as it is taught in schools and colleges, it is something that came with the colonizer. This is a very Western thing. And Indian science fiction tries to negotiate with this problem of exteriority, of something that is alien, something that is foreign, right? So, by the way, because I'm just looking at my screen and I don't know whether you're able to see all these slide changes. Just could you let me know whether the slides are changing, normally, or am I stuck with the with one slide? If there is a problem, please just raise your voice and let me know. As Hans Harder says, that in 19th century India, religion and philosophy, they were used to negotiate with the pressure of writing something that is originally very, very foreign. Development of science fiction, it started happening in the 19th century in Bengali context. You might remember there's a story by Jagadish Chandra Basu, which was written, it was called Niruddeshar Kahini first, then it was later renamed as Palatok Tufan. That was towards the end of the 19th century. Even before that, Shashi Chandra Dutt had written a speculative story of, that India is going to win freedom in 1945, getting very close to the actual date. It was majorly practiced by vernacular writers, and chiefly these three languages in which science fiction had a bit of a flourish: Bengali, Marathi, and Hindi. But accommodation of European science has been a problem. So how much sciencey you can be, or how much of an old mythology you are going to bring in. So in this, we all remember how Vivekananda even had differentiated between the spiritual East and the mechanical West. But one philosopher's or religious leader's name here I have mentioned, and Saraswati, and his concept of Vedic science. Now, Vedic science is a belief, and it is very relevant these days, that things that are scientific, that are now tried to be explained in terms of ancient knowledge, such as Viman, right? This is thought to be something that was there in ancient India, and this is just not only speculation. In November 2020, the director of IIT Kharagpur, which is one of the premier institutions of technology and science in India, V.K. Tiwari, has said that the institute would now look into the prospect of finding the scientific basis of Pushpak Rath. We remember this part of our childhood tales of how Ravan had abducted Sita on that Pushpak Rath, but he says that there must have been some kind of a science behind that. It is not mythology, it is science, so we are going to find it. And as reports are to be believed, there is going to be a serious funding that IIT KGP is going to have to try to find out the scientific basis of Pushpak Rath, right? So this is in our imagination, and this is how we many a times approach science. So in science fiction, by the way, there's a difference between hard science fiction and soft science fiction. Hard science fiction is where you delve into the realities of science, scientific discoveries. You try to back up your story with plausible scientific explanations. But in soft science fictions, you kind of move away from that. You bring in other sociological concerns like gender, like alienation, caste, different kind of things you can bring in, right? But when we talk about hard science fiction, and we expect that the scientists, if they were writing science fiction, they would be doing that. But that is also not the case with India so much. Particularly, we may mention the name of Jayant Vishnu Narlikar. He was a professor of astrophysics, and he was a student of Fred Hoyle, very well-known astrophysicist. So Jayant Vishnu Narlikar, when science fiction, many times he brought in mythological elements. Though he was a scientist, and in most of his texts, these are very well explained scientifically, but mythology always kind of crept in. Now, in the nationalist imagination, when the nation building process was on, in the Nehruvian era, when Nehru was putting a lot of focus on scientific institutes to be established and emerging as a powerful entity through scientific discoveries, during that time, like post-independence, 50s, 60s, 70s, you have writers trying to write science fiction with more science in it, but mythology has always been a part of it. I have mentioned one Bangla text, by the way, that is by Narayan Sharma, the personal favorite. This Nokkhotra Loke Debatta is, by the way, an adaptation of Arthur C. Clarke's story, 2001 A Space Odyssey, which has later been made into a film by Stanley Kubrick. Now, Narayan Sharma is known to have a scientific mind, and in this, he takes quite a few pages to explain Einstein's theory of relativity. But here again, he would bring in Vedic science, he would bring in ancient scriptures, to back up the Western story of 2001 Space Odyssey. I'm mentioning Vandana Singh here. She is one of the writers that I'll be taking up for discussion later. Vandana Singh's A Speculative Manifesto, in there, she, as well as Upinder Mehan. Upinder Mehan is the editor of a very well-known collection of post-colonial science fiction called So Long Been Dreaming. Both of them talk about India speculating into future with the help of myth and Upinder Mehan says that if we do not do it, someone else is going to do it for us. Now, So Long Been Dreaming is a collection of post-colonial science fiction, and whenever we talk about science fiction written in India, we have to also think about this aspect of science fiction writing, that is post-colonial response, because as I mentioned, science in India is thought to be or seen to be as being imported from outside. This is a very foreign influence, and it has now to be countered by something that is essentially Indian. I will now deviate for 2 or 3 slides to the science fiction and feminist reading. I have mentioned here 2 stories. One is by Lester Del Rey called Helen O'Loy, as the name is very close to Helen of Troy, and No One Born by Catherine L. Moore. Right. Lester Del Rey, he's a man. His story is the production of a mechanical woman, a woman that is a robot. But unlike Mary Shelley's story, in which the creator of such a creation is, he goes through a lot of pain and he loses so many of his near and dear ones. Here we find that Lester Del Rey's story doesn't pose much of a question. Rather, the man who has created this woman, who is very beautiful, by the way, she's like Helen of Troy. The man is happy to have created something like that, and the woman, the machine woman, is absolutely under control of this man. But on the other hand, No Woman Born, another story which was written 6 years after the Lester Del Rey story, that poses a lot of questions. There is an actor, singer, who unfortunately has an accident, and she can only survive by replacing many of her limbs with mechanical things, and she is now part woman. But that story poses a lot of questions regarding gender, regarding what it means to be human, what it means to be woman, how much woman you are now and how much machine you are. So all these questions that could have been asked by Lester Del Rey but did not, because that was a very easy equation of the male scientist dominating over the female creation. Catherine L. Moore does not do that. She explores the possibilities, right? And I have mentioned 3 other texts. They are very famous writers. Ursula K. Le Guin, The Left Hand of Darkness, The Female Man by Joanna Russ, and Bloodchild by Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler talks about a very fictitious scenario in which a man is, he is in a different planet, and he is surrounded by a lizard-like race. And because he has formed fascination with one of them, he agrees to incubate young offspring of that person that he has, if not fallen in love, but has become very fond of, in his own body. So Octavia Butler is here, putting a lot of questions on the plate, like what it means when a man tries to reproduce. Can a man do that? So these questions, if not they are satisfactorily answered, the science fictional texts by women writers, these questions are at least asked, right? As Brian Atterby notes here, that the master narrative of science fiction has always been told in sexual terms. It represents knowledge, innovation, which is very masculine, while nature, the passive object, and that is feminine. So this very easy convenience is something that female science fiction writers, or women science fiction writers, they try to combat, they try to resist, right? So here I have, tried to talk about how over the decades the readings have, gone changing. I'm eliding over these slides because I want to come to my the 2 texts that I have chosen to discuss in, if not in detail, but at least in some detail. Indian women writers and science fiction, if we look at them, then of course the problem is doublefold, as is the case with many fields of literature, like black feminism, when you are oppressed by both of your patriarchal framework and as well as your racial disparity. Indian women writers who write science fiction are also hard pressed against these dual challenges. First of all, you are veering into a men's domain, so-called men's domain, and then you are doing something which is supposedly very Western in nature. So how do you negotiate that? Feminist or a female utopia is a very common concept in science fiction written by women, in which these female utopias, a utopia is projected, speculated, a future utopia in which racial disparity would not exist. Women will have a lot of education. And one such example is that of Rokeya Shafat Hossain's Sultana's Dream, that was back in 1905. Now I'm talking about science fiction in English by Indian women writers, right? And there are vernacular examples. But when you look at the English scenario, then we have to kind of jump almost 90 odd years to come to Manjula Padmanabhan's play Harvest and Escape. I've just given names of some of the important writers of science fiction. Of course, there are quite a few others, right? And I will be here focusing on these two texts. One is by Rimi B. Chatterjee called Signal Red. The other one is by Vandana Singh of Love and Other Monsters, right? The first one is a novel. The second one is a novel. It was originally written in 2005. The ebook version came out in 2011, and the book talks about a future India, which is situated in 2015. So even when the ebook came out, it was a bit of a futuristic India, right? This story of a super secret defense science lab in which there's a man called Gopal Chandran, who is a scientist and who is following orders, and he knows that the center is making weapons, but what is being done with the weapons, he doesn't know. Now, Rimi Chatterjee's book is, or the novel Signal Red, is not focused on what is happening in the science lab. It is one of the concerns, but also what is this Sanskrit scholar Rahil Vidyadhar is doing. Now, Rahil Vidyadhar is brought in by the director of the center to try to explain the scientific discoveries in ancient Sanskritic terms. Ancient Sanskritic terms. Am I okay? So anyway, so Rimi B. Chatterjee's Signal Red, as well as Vandana Singh's. By the way, this is a writer that if you are interested, please focus on us. A very serious writer. Both of these fictional texts, they critique a totalitarian India, the fundamental India, and they try to show the confluence between science and religion. They are not putting science and religion as binary opposites. They are showing how religion sometimes acts as an key to maneuver the scientific discoveries. And in their text, they are not only intervening as women writers, but they are also intervening through questions of sex, questions of gender. In Rimi Chatterjee's novels, the disruption comes to women. In Vandana novella, the central character Arun is actually an alien. He is trapped in a man's body, but he's very fluid gender-wise. So Indian women's science fiction, it has started to veer away from being very myth-centric. Vandana Singh's Distances is an example of that. Priya Saruki Chavriya's book Destination 14 is another example. So it is an area which is to be mapped yet, which is to be mapped properly, but more and more work would be done, and it would do great work in its intervention into a field of study, field of writing, which is thought to be very predominantly male. Okay, with this wrap up, hopefully some of you will be interested in exploring this particular area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarkar, for your valuable insights. And it was an interesting read. Moving on to our next speaker, Dr. Shubha Basu, Associate Professor, Vijay Krishna Girls College.
Thank you, Divya. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
My esteemed colleagues and my dear students, I'm going to talk on feminist tints in restoration drama. Since time is short, I have to be selective. In the closing decades of the 17th century, women dramatists like Aphra Behn, Mary Picks, Delarive Manley, and Catherine Trotter began writing plays that were enacted on public stage. This caused a masculinist backlash, and in 1697, an anonymous male writer wrote a play entitled The Female Wits, the Triumvirate of Woman, or Rehearsal, to satirize these contemporary women dramatists. Other women found a new freedom to work and to earn as professional actresses. The milieu of the theatre proved to be a space free of bourgeois assumptions about women being vessels of refined feelings, delicacy, purity, and passivity. The charms of some of these women attracted the attention of the high and mighty of the land, and mention may be made here of Nell Gwynn, the actress who was a mistress of King Charles II, as well as of Anne Brace Girdle, the actress who performed as Araminta in The Old Bachelor and Milama in The Way of the World, and with whom Congreve reportedly fell in love. Indeed, it can be argued that a new idea of femininity, different from the older idea of woman as weak and intellectually lacking, came to grow due to the representation in restoration drama of women capable of holding their own against men in wit battles. The restoration dramatists Sir George Etheridge, William Wycherley, John Vanbrugh, George Farquhar, and William Congreve, perhaps because they were creative men who worked professionally in the more socially liberated environment of the theatre, seem to be occasionally capable of offering alternative realizations of women in their plays. Some women characters in Etheridge adopt a stance of obliquity towards the dominant patriarchal modes of thought and behavior. Like Harriet in The Man of Mode, Gary and Ariana in She Would If She Could are not the feeble and unthinking woman of the stereotypical male imagination, but intelligent and articulate individuals. Another powerfully ambiguous figure is Lady Cockwood in She Would If She Could, who is represented as a comic figure embodying the concept of overaged and therefore inappropriate sexual desire. In The Country Wife, however, Wycherley proves to be more querulous of the male myths of sexual potency, male dominance, phallic aggression, and female submissiveness. The women in his play are quite capable of challenging and even violating the norms of patriarchy. There is instability present in the plays of Farquhar, a tension between recognition of women's freedom and an adherence to patriarchal norms, with the balance slightly tilted in favor of the latter. William Congreve, however, opened up a dialogue on the position and status of women in his society. The main female characters in The Double Dealer, Lady Touchwood, Lady Froth, Lady Plant, are clearly depicted as women who go to the extent of proposing female ethics as an alternative to the patriarchal one prevalent at that time. Cynthia and Melephant in Love for Love anticipate Milama and Mirabel in The Way of the World, in rejecting male regardings of wives as subordinates by opting for an alternative understanding of marriage as a symbiotic relationship between equal partners. The modern feminist thinker Anne McClintock has indicated how women were once considered. Quote, by nature rendered incapable of equal contract with men under political law, since women are naturally subordinate, yet women can and must make marriage contracts, since marriage was to be seen as a matter of consent, not coercion. Through these debates, liberal theory formed an ideological distinction between the right to contract of the political sphere and the refusal of the right to such political status within the domestic conjugal sphere, unquote. It is just this question that Congreve addresses in the proviso scene in The Way of the World. However, the case of Lady Wishfort in the same play locates woman in another frame of reference. For all her apparently indecorous sexuality, Lady Wishfort is an educated woman who has a fine collection of books in her closet. As already mentioned, there is a patriarchal bias in making fun of the desire of post-menopausal women like Lady Wishfort to remarry. And Lady Wishfort's desire reminds us of what an American feminist wrote in 1918. Quote, feminists are not nuns. That should be established. We want to love and to be loved. And most of us want children. We want this precious sex knowledge, not just for ourselves, the conscious feminists. We want it for all the millions of unconscious feminists that swarm the earth. We want it for women, unquote. In conclusion, I would like to argue that there are anticipations in restoration comedy of what Luce Irigaray in An Ethics of Sexual Difference called for. Quote, the necessity for man, that is, humanity, to glimpse something other, something not of his world, not built to his specifications. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Basu. Next, we move on to our next speaker, Dr. Nabanita Mukherjee, Associate Professor, Vijay Krishna Girls College. Over to you.
Yeah, am I audible? Divya?
Yes, you are.
Okay, just a moment. Okay, I'm going to talk on trauma, women, and women's writing today. Hello everybody. I should have told that before. Now, trauma and its representation in language and just a moment. Oh God. Yes, trauma and its representation in language and the role of memory and the role of memory of trauma in shaping individual and cultural identities are the central concerns of trauma studies. Trauma studies explores the impact of trauma in literature and society by analyzing its psychological, social, and cultural significance. The way in which identity, the unconscious and remembering are influenced by extreme events is a crucial focus in this area. Trauma studies developed in the 1990s and relied on Freudian theory to develop an extreme relied on Freudian theory to develop a model of trauma that imagines an extreme experience that challenges identity formation and ruptures meaning. This model presupposes that trauma is unspeakable. The idea that a traumatic experience challenges the limits of language, fragments the psyche, and shatters the self basically, and even ruptures and distorts a meaning, codable meaning, that is, to the brain. These parameters set the initial pillars of the field and continues to impact the critical conversation on the relation between trauma, women, and women's literature. The first wave trauma theorists were Kathy Karoth, Susanna Fellman, and Jeffrey Hartman. Cassie Karoth's trauma model draws attention to the severity of suffering by suggesting that trauma or traumatic experience irrevocably damages the psyche. The trauma model talked about in most specifically Karoth in her seminal work Unclaimed Experience, Trauma, Narrative History, this was 1996, takes a particular interpretation of Freud's trauma theories to present a post-structural concern with the referential limits of language and history. This analysis set the tone for the critical study regarding the relation between individual and cultural trauma. Individual trauma in women, now in women, because we are specifically focusing on women, not that trauma doesn't impact other gender categories in a similar way. Let us focus only on women today. Now, individual trauma in women resulting in post-traumatic stress disorder, popularly known as PTSD, or chronic or continuous post-traumatic stress disorder. This is relatively a newer term. This is called CPTSD, can leave a profound impact on people, not only who have been the victims of trauma, but people around them, people who live with them and around them. And this can be transmitted, that is, the results of trauma, the havocs of trauma can be transmitted across a time and become part also of genetic memory. And hence, this can become trans-historic trauma and even intergenerational trauma. Now, this means that trauma passes through generations. and it also has the power, the tremendous power to mutate genetical structures in human beings. Now, not only trauma is capable, as I said, of altering an individual's identity, memory, beliefs, emotions, and perception of the world around, both inner world and outer world, it is capable of creating severely abnormal immune responses in the body, and thus become source of even untreatable diseases for future generations. Now, if we look at, just a moment. Now, it is because of this reason precisely Karoth has said in her interpretation of Freud's Moses and monotheism, this is 1939, that history like trauma, this I quote, history like trauma is never simply one's own. That history is precisely the way we are implicated in each other's traumas. She emphasizes a universalist view of trauma that damages the psyche and evokes a shared response across time. This brings us to the trope of transhistoric or intergenerational trauma in Karoth. Trauma, even when caused to an individual, has the power of being transmitted across time. And the infectious potential of trauma is paired with the timelessness of an extreme experience and its transhistoric potential. This explains cultural trauma. A cultural group's traumatic experience in the historical past can also be part of psychic landscape of the contemporary individual who did not in person become the victory of that original trauma. Now, and the contemporary individual who belongs to the same cultural group. Now, the emphasis in Karoth's model on the intrinsic relationship between individual and cultural group, as well as the dissociative and silencing effects of trauma, brings trauma theory closer to feminist criticism that brings into its purview gender, race, class, and caste. Now, if we look at randomly assorted texts written by women across times, across divergent cultures, we can notice women as gendered beings, women as victims of trauma. We notice women as trauma victims share a similar mental time frame in spite of distance and difference in their actual time and in their actual geographical space barriers, and how they strive similarly to come to terms with their harrowing past. Now, two texts that I'm going to cite as example here are The Wrongs of Women, this is 1798 by Mary Wollstonecraft, and The Hiding Place, this is 2000 by Teresa Azzopardi. She was a Welsh writer, also nominated for the Booker Prize and got several other recognitions and prizes. These two works, these two authors in these two specific works, they show how not just one incidence of unspeakable traumatic blow or violence, but also verbal and physical abuse, torture, rejection, stigmatization, and just absence of care, lack of affection, acceptance, and security or support, all are tantamount to life-changing traumatic experience. And all that can become fountainheads of trauma. And all this is obvious in the rudely present in patriarchy's relationship with women. Now, needless to say, these are far-reaching sources and fountainheads of extreme future traumatic results, and this results in historical and transgenerational trauma, which again affects countless female children and women in the most negative of ways. Now, women often, irrespective of class or caste divide, become victims in reality or genetic memory, as certain forms of trauma against them represent consequences of institutionalized forms of trauma. As a trauma psychiatrist, Bessel van der Kolk, as noted in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma, I quote, "One does not have to be a combat soldier or visit a refugee camp in Syria or the Congo to encounter trauma. Trauma happens to us, our friends, our families, and our neighbors. Research by the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention has shown that 1 in 5 Americans were sexually molested as a child. 1 in 4 was beaten by a parent to the point of a mark being left on their body. And 1 in 3 couples engages in physical violence. A quarter of us grew up with alcoholic relatives, and 1 out of 8 witnessed their mother being beaten or hit." Now, women are, as you already know, this is for students to make it most lucid. You already know that women are the most subjugated in day-to-day life, and also in the historicity that places the gendered identity of women, sees them as a result of facts as the victims of servitude. And in the origin of family, private property, and the state, this is 1885, Engels has remarked that, I quote, "The first class oppression coincides with that of the female sex by the male." But let me point out here that Marxism subsumes gender under class, but Engels has spoken about the subjugation and servility and domination of oppression of women, and hence, as the oppressed class, women are the victims of trauma more often than men, of course. And thus Engels acknowledged that what Hildy Hartmann calls I quote again, "two separate but interlocking sets of social relations, capitalism and patriarchy, each with a material base, each with its own dynamic. Any social system in which a Marxist analysis uncovers oppressive practices often becomes metaphorical in feminist rhetoric of the oppression of women, class, race, slavery, and colonization furnish as dominant tropes of oppression. If male-female relations are constructed in class terms, then men are the ruling class, as August Strindberg explains in Julie. In Miss Julie, written in 1888, the aristocratic Julie is sexually mastered by her father's servant, I quote, "simply because he is a man. Sexually he is..." Simply because he is a man, sexually he is an aristocrat. If the trope shifts from class to caste, women become untouchables. One can leave one class in order to move into another, notes Simone de Beauvoir, but caste is the group into which one is born and which one cannot leave. If white women are imagined to be metaphorical blacks, then the invisibility of the blacks in a Eurocentric society can become the model of delineating the corresponding invisibility of women in a patriarchy, and thus the denial of opportunities to women constitutes as apartheid. And because the history of black-white relations is also the history of slavery, the analogy with slavery is already present in Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women. This is 1792, and becomes the dominant trope in 19th century feminist writing. As a consequence of feminist involvement in the abolitionist movement, I quote, "No slave is a slave to the same length and in so full a sense of the word as a wife is." These are the words by John Stuart Mill. And I continue. More recently, the subjugation of women has been analogized in third world terms, either as what Campbell calls visceral colonialism, or as what Anne Summers, following Barbara Burris, goes on to call a fourth world of women colonized by men. This plight of women is as a colonized sex then comes closer to Frantz Fanon's analysis of colonialism in The Wretched of the Earth. This is 1961. Now I'll quickly come to Virginia Woolf and then round up. Now, Woolf in the Diary of Virginia Woolf puts the waves into a series of dramatic soliloquies in the rhythm of waves. In fact, she makes a situation in which the characters enter into, I quote, "the privacy of self-analysis of the speech." And they start defining themselves as if they ride on waves and surf together through them. In other words, the characters reveal their privacy and themselves by their speeches or through soliloquies. And here we have three females, Rhoda, Ginny, and Susan, who are traumatized in terms of their selves, and the construction of their individual and collective identities are traumatized. Now, Rhoda's suicide and the feeling of her nothingness, this of course is a cultural trauma of women, and many women share a similar experience worldwide, across class. Of course, the lower the class, lower the economic status, this become all the more difficult and more vivid. Now, Rhoda's suicide and her feeling of nothingness or non-becoming and annihilation, Ginny's act of showing off and her behaving against current norms of patriarchal society, and Susan's ambivalent emotions, the feelings of love and hatred, extreme emotions of love and hatred, that is, as well as her being imprisoned or captured in patriarchal culture, are discussed in the novel. and the male and the female characters are in quest of the reconstruction of their traumatized identities. Here, Woolf is also concerned about the trauma of the men in the novel, though the central characters are these three women. Now, Woolf, by revising her individual and cultural traumas in her fiction and non-fictional works, tries to elevate heal her traumatized identity has so much continued to intrigue her into a self-isolation of sorts. Now, The Waves, as Woolf confesses, is an autobiographical novel. Woolf's novel is preoccupied with her personal, painful and traumatic experiences. For example, her half-brother's sexual violations caused her show some responses as post-traumatic stress disorders, so that she is ashamed of looking at her own face in the mirror. In The Waves, she describes it through Rhoda to recover or come to terms with her own shattered identity and Rhoda's traumatized self and identity. Now, despite the fact that Woolf alleviates Rhoda's suffering and traumatized identity completely different, that is by death and annihilation. Now, on another instance, Woolf tells the memory regarding E.M. Foster's assaulting discussions about women in general that, I quote, "ladies are quite impossible." And this is something we often come across in our own culture. The women are portrayed in a very similar kind of way. And as if they cannot be understood, they are impossible, they are very, very strange. Ladies are quite impossible. This is what E.M. Foster had said. And she becomes so annoyed at his offensive expressions concerning ladies, and she opposes him severely. Woolf wants women to get their appropriate places and the rooms of their own. Now, rooms of their own obviously means space as well as agency. She cannot tolerate that women are assigned in the lowest position of the society. Now, Woolf, in her essay Professions for Women, in The Death of the Moth and other essays, considers women as self-sacrificing creatures who are completely devoted to their family of either their parents or their husbands, like the angel in their house. Again, within quotes, I quote, she was intensely sympathetic. She was utterly unselfish. She excelled in the difficult arts of family life. She sacrificed herself daily. The sort of woman portrayed by Woolf is the
Sorry to interrupt, Nabanita, it's running out of time. Yes,
yeah, just two more minutes. Now, okay, the sort of woman portrayed in Woolf as the sacrifice, as the woman who sacrifices, is again somebody who receives trauma and internalized patriarchy to become both the perpetrator and the victim of day-to-day trauma. In conclusion, Woolf decides to kill her traditional self and to create a newer one. And no wonder she restores her sexed and gendered identities, not just herself, but of the women here she is talking about, to their real identities. It means that identities without the bias of gendered roles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mukherjee. It has been a very interesting day. Next, we have Ms. Suyasha Mookim, Assistant Professor and Head of the Department English, Bijoy Krishna Girls College. Ms. Suyasha Mookim.
Thank you, Divyarati. Good evening to everybody present here, and I am very, very happy to be a part of this webinar. I'll just put on my power presentation and please tell me whether it's visible or not. 1 minute, please. The title of my paper, is it visible? Is my PowerPoint visible?
Yes, it is. It is.
Okay. Thank you. The title of my paper is Crushed Body and Quelled Spirits Morph into Hope, Poems of Protest by Vashum and Sharma. Here I talk about these two young poetesses talk about taboos which are kept under the carpet and not brought out. And I quote from Ian McEwan's Atonement, easily torn, not easily mended. The trauma of physical abuse felt by a girl child at the hands of family members leave a dark, painful smudge on the souls of abused children, which perhaps is indelible and remains as a permanent mark on the minds of the victimized children, even as they move into stages of adult life. These victims live and relive the torture and torment faced either once in their lives or day after day till life and memories merge together into a nightmare. In India, unfortunately, as yet, especially the female victims are stigmatized and made to feel guilty, adding to the trauma of their experience. The disgrace associated with being a victim of physical or sexual assault forces the girls and women who are the victims to keep the abuse and torture a secret. Unable to share their anxiety, fear, and above all, the agony of it all with the elders around them, who either dismiss it as a figment of the girl's imagination or a lie, or blame the little girl for attracting the wrong kind of attention, all happiness from the childhood or the life disappears. And what is left is a big throbbing affliction and anger. In this paper, I deal with the activist poetry of two young poetesses, Yumi Vashum and A.N. Sharma. The collection of poems called Love, Lust and Loyalty by Yumi Vashum charts a complex trajectory of a girl child's life where rape becomes a permanent part of each and every night spent in her grandmother's house where she grew up. Her process of recovery and survival technique, despite being simple as a concept, is actually quite a complex procedure. On the other hand, the assorted poems by A.N. Sharma entitled Drunk on Pain, High on Hope is a tapestry of words on the one emotion felt by all victims of abuse, pain, and her antidote to this emotional volcano is hope. I want to draw everybody's attention to a rhyme. This is the rhyme. It is a very popular nursery rhyme. This old man, he played one. I would like to read out certain stanzas of this rhyme. This old man, he played 5. He played knick-knack on my thigh. This old man, he played 10. He played 9. He played knick-knack up my spine. Now, let us ponder and answer to ourselves, why would an old man play anything on the body parts of a child? There are many nursery rhymes and fairy tales which are replete with suggestive imagery of cruelty inflicted on the vulnerable. Perhaps this children's song talks about child abuse. I am presenting some poems which are real experiences as a poem. The poem is visible on the right side of the screen, and these are lines from Yumi Vashum from Ukhrul, Manipur, 21 years of age at the time of publication of her book, which is 2017, she had the courage to bring a taboo subject out into the open. The lines touched the conscience of the reader in harsh, jarring notes. The act of protest demands the courageous action of bringing out the problem in the open, no matter how uncomfortable it is. And here the poetess does just that. The book is entitled Love, Lust, and Loyalty. I will just read a portion of this poem. I lost count of the nights, these nights, because from dusk to dawn I'd imagined myself invisible, without a form or a soul, a 7-year-old kid floating in the night air, waiting for the sun to come up. And parents, aunties, uncles, sirs, madams, all of them lecturing. Your virginity is your virtue. Do they know? Do they think about girls like me? This virtue they talk of, it's too brittle. These are poems from A.N. Sharma's Drunk on Pain, High on Hope. She was age 14 at the time of the publication of this book, and please read the poems she has written. Oblivion goes like this. You guided me into this oblivion and then shut me in to be sucked into this black hole. Me Too is another horrific version of a poem, brings out horrific imageries. For an 8-year-old, it was just a game of hide and seek, being called in dark nooks and corners and being held close, rubbed against, just a game of hide and seek. As these poems show, the perpetrator of the abuse is a family member or a person well known to the victim. The effects of this kind of abuse on minors leads to immense mental agony. Here it is represented through the poems of these young ladies. I want to specify here that it is not just girls or females who go through sexual abuse. 1 in 7 boys in India, they also go through sexual abuse. But here, because of the support structure of a society which leans heavily towards patriarchy, the boys are able to come out of it or garner their guilt and desperation into some other kind of trajectory so that they do not suffer as much as women do or girls do. Please look at the poem. I still have my haunted dark days, a whirlpool of emotions trying to suck me. It makes me want to jump off a tall building and watch my blood splatter, or throw myself at a running train, watch my body fall off in chunks. The struggle is real. Again, she writes, Vashum writes, bones breaking from within, guts coiled out your navel with an iron bar. These lines are suggestive of some kind of horrific incident which happened in Delhi, Nirbhaya case. You begin to choke on food, water, even air. You are at the edge of the cliff, falling, hands in the air, feet helplessly trying to hold ground. So these are the poems that she has written, and these are the feelings that the victim goes through: guilt, self-depreciation, low self-esteem, and violence on self. Here, Sharma presents the violence on oneself. I cut myself until I'm unsure what hurts more, the ache in my heart or the physical pain. Here, literature is not just a mirror of society. Here, literature is the mirror of the soul. Here, literature is the outcry of the pent-up feelings which the victims go through. And again, I present the poems of Sharma, where she says, where she again describes her feelings, and she feels being crushed, and she feels that everybody, or rather the abuser, has added to her load instead of sharing it. As I said earlier, that the abusers are known to the victims. Now, why does this happen? Mike Friel, he says, he has researched on this, and he says that it is a power play. I read what I've written in the slide. Some adults abuse a child to feel the power and control they don't feel in their relationship with other adults. Sometimes adults who have intimate relationships with other adults may physically abuse children in moments of unusual stress, such as after the loss of a job or during a divorce. Some adults are primarily sexually attracted to children, and some never act on those feelings. Some adults act impulsively when presented with an unexpected opportunity to abuse a child. Other people, particularly youth with high social status or with social or emotional delays, may not even fully understand the harmful impact of their actions. Physical abuse is not just a matter of pathological individuals. In fact, feminists have said that we cannot call the abusers pathological because it takes away or it discounts their heinous crime by calling them patients of mental problems. So physical abuse is not just a matter of pathological individuals, but is a social and cultural problem of gender and power. Unfortunately, negative and stereotypical attitudes towards women of all age groups are commonplace among men, including boys and young men, and are not specific to sexual offenders. This commonplace nature of these problematic attitudes does not minimize the abusive action of young people. Rather, it emphasizes that such behavior is tacitly and sometimes explicitly condoned within the cultural context of many people. And then comes the anger against the elders for lack of guidance on such matters, important matters as one's own body, one's own self. And here Vasu questions, did they know? Did they not know? Was it shame? Was it disgust? I buried myself in a field of cosmos, playing with it as I plucked off the petals, chanting, did they know? Did they not know? Hidden behind a piece of cloth, they talk about it in hushed tones. This is a very pertinent question which she asks. Why would mothers not talk about vagina? Don't they know it's as important as my limbs? Along with the feeling of pain and anger comes a stark feeling of loneliness. And loneliness, as Sharma puts it, is, quote, menacingly my demons spat acid. The road is deserted for miles and miles. Sucked, drained, I feel life frown. Please notice the small I. It is very important because of the guilt, the loneliness, and the kind of mental agony that the victim goes through. I feel life frown. My soul is being razed to the ground. Face it, my love, I tell myself. You are on your own. No one is coming. No one is around. And Vashum writes, a 7-year-old kid floating in the night air, waiting for the sun to come up. And parents, aunties, uncles, sirs, madams, all of them lecturing, your virginity is your virtue. Yet, the idea is not to give up, but empower oneself and evolve away from the pain and the falsity of guilt. So we have Sharma writing the 3 Gs, get up, get out, get going. And Vashum writes, all these glorious years I have wasted in anger, shame, regret, the bitterness I birthed over the years. I wish I had known sooner. The battle of the mind is won only by forgiveness. And forgiveness carries no cost, only peace. I wish I won this war sooner. And if you have fought demons like I did, I hope you win the war sooner than I did. These are some more images of resilience, rising out, coming out of the mental agony. And here, Sharma writes, scars of triumph. She didn't hide her scars. Looking at them didn't scare her. Rather, the ghosts of the past fueled her with courage to go far. They told people of the battles she has fought and got through. They told them to beware. She was a warrior, not a dummy to spar. And finally, what is more important is empowering oneself and coming out of it all. So here we have Vashum writing, "Today, as I sit here and write this, recalling feelings I never wanted to, I weep for the little children like me who suffered alone. I hope they get to read this, and in their lowest moments, I hope they remember we moved past the abuse. We can move past anything, childhood to adulthood." And she makes a resolution here. "I will teach my daughter to own every part of her body, from the roots of her hair to the tip of her toenails. My daughter will be strong, not meek. Earn respect, not take. Give only when deserved." These are again some more poems where Sharma is saying that heart should be strong and soul should be elevated. And I quote Maya Angelou here, and Sharma talks about becoming a phoenix. "You are a phoenix. You have power. You have the potential to rise again. But for that, you need to burn. You need to be destroyed and ruined to the depths to rise. You are a phoenix." Anyway, we come to the term empowerment. And I will just read a small line from here, not going to the full slide. Empowerment is multidimensional, social, and process. It is multidimensional in that it occurs within sociological, psychological, economic, and other dimensions. Empowerment also occurs at various levels, such as individual, group, community. Empowerment, by definition, is a social process since it occurs in relationship to others. I move on to the poetry, and I talk, and then they display power from within. And Sharma, this is from Sharma, and this is from Vashum, where she says, "I write for battered souls like me to forgive, forget, and only live. That what is done to us in the shadows shall not stop us from living life. We are air. We don't bend. We don't break. We are unprecedented." So the poems evoke a strong sense of remonstration against injustice. Reading the poems perhaps make us cringe, right? But they do evoke a strong sense of remonstration against injustice of the society towards the most vulnerable section of society, that is children. And even more vulnerable is the girl child, who lacks support in our patriarchal society. And what better and potent way to do it, to protest against that which the society hides, than through poetry. Thank you.
Thank you, Suyasha, for such a wonderful presentation. The next paper has been written by Dr. Krishna Bhakta. Just a second, excuse me. Dr. Krishna Bhakta, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Bijoy Krishna Girls College. And unfortunately, he's unwell, so I would request Nabanita, Dr. Nabanita Mukherjee to read out his paper on his behalf. Nabanita, can you hear me?
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
I can't turn on the camera. Okay, just a moment. Yeah. Okay, this is by Professor Krishna Bhakta. He's not well, so let me read it out to you. This paper is called Eustacia and Tess, an Eco-Feminist Reading of Thomas Hardy. Now, Thomas Hardy's tragic fiction seems to echo many of the assertions made by contemporary eco-feminist critics. A close reading of Hardy's last 4 tragic novels reveal seemingly limitless approaches within an eco-feminist reading of Hardy's work. The social causes behind this can be traced in Hardy's age, that is the Victorian era, industrial revolution, urbanization, changes in social norms and tension caused by gendered role shifting, all become apparent in a study of Victorian England's social atmosphere, and all these occur during a vast change to the country's natural environment and people's necessary interactions with nature. Hardy was concerned with the plights of women, nature, and other non-dominant portions of his world. Just as ecofeminism asserts, Hardy portrays a world in which oppression by a patriarchal order is the root of the plight of women. Thomas Hardy's tragic fiction seems to echo many of the concerns that disturb eco-critics and eco-feminists. Prominent in eco-criticism is a critique of binaries such as man-nature, man/nature, culture/nature, machine/agriculture, indigenous rural life versus city. Hardy too is interested in delineating how these markers are culturally viewed as mutually exclusive oppositions. Hardy's England is a country passing through an age of transition. It is becoming an industrialized nation from a primarily agricultural one. The Industrial Revolution changed the people with peasant occupations and local markets into an industrialized society exposed to rapid globalization. In The Return of the Native, we first see Eustacia Y, the central protagonist, the woman protagonist of the novel, as, and there goes a quote, a figure against the sky. End of the quote. On Rainbarrow, mystically caught up in the wind in a way that even Gabriel Oak wasn't on Norcombe Hill. The wind of Egdon is the voice of a pagan past, older and stronger than anything human. It blows through the dead. Heath bells, chapter 1. And Eustacia joins in, again a quote, the heather bells that had broken silence. At last, so did the woman, and her articulation was but as another phrase of the same discourse as theirs. This is also chapter 1. Thus, Eustacia is deeply associated with the environment, with the heath, sharing its wild, untamable, and passionate nature. But like Boldwood in Far from the Madding Crowd, she is made unproductive by excessive passion. She may blend into the heath well enough, echo its moods, appear as the queen of its dark soul, but she has none of the care, responsibility, or feeling for the place that could make her identification with it something productive. The heath, for example, produces little enough firewood, but what Grandfer has collected, what her grandfather had collected, she can waste on a fire that signals her presence to a man she is interested in. Hardy also relates his mummer's play to this theme of establishing traditions in the novel, for he has Eustacia usurp the role of the Turkish knight, the villain, and the character who killed the valiant crusader but is finally slain by the righteous St. George, as an indication of Eustacia's transgressive role in the traditional community of Egdon Heath. This is why she is so strange and interesting a character. She is deep in spite of her restlessness and her desire for anything unattainable and divided by the complex mixture between pagan and Christian worlds. Eustacia constantly craves for self-expression. She wants to be herself, attain herself, but she does not know how. By what means? She is a poor trapped bird, and there's a quotation, the wings of her soul were broken by the cruel obstructiveness of all about her. Hardy hints at her tremendous sexual energy that tears her apart, and indeed it is evident that she will give herself within force to any man who loves her enough to interest her. She longs for exquisite pain, sublime erotic anguish. It is a challenging, not a tame lover that she needs. Finally, doomed by her environment, she kills herself at the end by jumping into a weir and becoming part of the heath and part of nature itself. Then the paper goes on to discuss Tess. The subtitle of the novel, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, is a pure woman. Intelligent, strikingly attractive, and distinguished by her deep moral sensitivity and passionate intensity, she is more than a distinctive individual. Hardy makes her into somewhat of a mythical heroine. Her name, formerly Teresa, recalls Saint Teresa of Avila, another martyr whose vision of a higher reality cost her her life. Other characters often refer to Tess in the mythical terms as when Angel calls her with quote, daughter of nature in chapter 18, or refers to her by the Greek figures Artemis and Demeter in chapter 20. The author himself sometimes describes Tess as more than an individual woman, as something closer to a mythical incarnation of a woman. Hardy demonstrates his deep moral sympathy for England's lower classes, particularly for rural women too, exposing the sexual hypocrisy of the male-dominated Victorian England. But not just the two novels or the two characters that this paper discusses are to be interpreted or can be interpreted in eco-feminist terms. Thomas Hardy's tragic fiction seems to echo many of the concerns, as has already been said, that disturb eco-critics and eco-feminists. In novel after novel, Hardy presents characters who come from the city to intrude upon rural life and its values, finally destroying them. These characters, devoid of any values, interestingly, are all men who are abusive towards women and use them and finally discard them. Examples are Fitzpiers in The Woodlanders, Sergeant Troy in Far from the Madding Crowd, Farfrae in The Mayor of Casterbridge, and Alec in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. These characters threaten the peace and the life of not only the women but the entire rural atmosphere. The major women characters like Tess, Bathsheba, or the minor ones like Thomasin in spirit merge into nature. They are the ones who represent the older order, old values, old morality, and are threatened and cheated by men who believe to be, whom they believe to be their lovers. Hardy demonstrates his deep moral sympathy for an agrarian world which...
Nabanita, sorry to interrupt once again. I mean,
Yes,
we are running out of time.
Human rights. Yes,
yes,
and these women become sexually overpowered by the new order as mechanization overpowers the agricultural civilization. Old money is overpowered. Old money is overpowered by the new, and old moral standards by sexual hypocrisy become more and more prominent in Hardy's world. Thank you.
Thank you. Next and our very last speaker, Miss Anwesha Maity. I request Miss Anwesha Maity to please 1 second, excuse me. Yeah, Miss Anwesha Maity, research scholar, University of Hyderabad.
Am I audible?
Yes.
I hope I am. Okay. A very good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I only know Suyasha ma'am, but it was extremely lovely, especially to hear the students' papers and also the papers by the esteemed speakers before me. I would speak on the concept of Manic Pixie Dream Girl, and I have attempted a read of the character of Leela from Vibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay's Oppo trilogy with the lens of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. The title of my paper is Leela, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl in Vibhutibhushan's Oppo trilogy. The Manic Pixie Dream Girl is one of the most used tropes of contemporary popular cinema. The stock character can be found especially in the late 90s and early 20s American popular films. The term was coined by film critic Nathan Robin in 2007, who said, "Manic Pixie Dream Girl exists solely in the fevered imaginations of sensitive writer-directors to teach broodingly soulful young men to embrace life and its infinite mysteries and adventures." The Manic Pixie Dream Girl is a vivacious, more often than not traditionally beautiful, sometimes slightly misunderstood and rebellious woman who is dead set upon helping the male protagonist to either come of age or realize his true potential or become a hero, often at the cost of vilifying her own self. Even recent Bollywood films have also made ample use of this character trope. One of the most notable ones would be the one played by Kareena Kapoor in the film Jab We Met. The character's name was Geet. Anyway, however, upon close inspection, this particular trope of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, even before it was actually labeled as such, could be found in literature across the centuries. Specifically, Bildung's romance with male protagonists have made good use of this over the years, often without allowing the female characters to ever realize their full potential. These female characters have remained as mere support staff whose sole purpose has been to build the character arc of the protagonist. The American screenwriter Madison Perry, while writing for the New York Times, mentioned that the Manic Pixie Dream Girl will be troubled as well. She straddles the narrow line between quirky and crazy, mysterious and strange. She is perfectly imperfect, and that imperfection is the key because a Manic Pixie Dream Girl must be messed up enough to need saving, so the powerless guy can do something heroic in the third act. From Estella in Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, to Daisy in Henry James's Daisy Miller, to Camilla in the Secret History by Donna Tartt, to the more recent Alaska in Looking for Alaska by John Green, English literature is full of women laying the groundwork for a male character to be exalted, most often at a very personal cost. Interestingly, this character trope can be found in plenty of Bengali literature, plenty of Bengali novels and books as well. Hence, in my paper, I have intended to read the character of Leela, who first appeared in Pather Panchali as the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. The term Manic Pixie Dream Girl was added to the Oxford dictionaries in 2015 and was defined as a type of female character depicted as vivacious and appealingly quirky, whose main purpose within the narrative is to inspire a greater appreciation for life in a male protagonist. As mentioned previously, this character exists to build the narrative for the male protagonist solely. This stock character has a number of often contradictory characteristics other than the requisite quirk, zest, and beauty. Depending upon what the protagonist's character needs in order to come out in the best light possible, she can oscillate between a number of different roles. Claire Solomon, in her essay Anarcho-Feminist Melodrama and the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, mentions that this character exists in the measure that the male protagonist needs her. She has no backstory, no inner life. This particular character can act as a muse, inspiring the protagonist to seek a better fortune and remain unattainable, the likes of which would be Daisy in The Great Gatsby. Contrastingly, she can also be the caring nurturer, providing the protagonist with especially psychological support like Sam in Tiffany Jaworski's The Perks of Being a Wallflower. She can also be a troubled soul in desperate need of rescuing, often from her own self, and is there for the hero to save her. Whether she actually needs saving is an altogether different question. Consequently, it should be noted that the varied number of features attributed to the character trope in discussion are all considered feminine characteristics, from that of a muse to a caregiver to a vulnerable damsel in distress. These features are rooted in deeply traditional gender roles. The very concept of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl can be heard echoed in Virginia Woolf's words. Shatidi spoke extensively about Woolf's A Room of One's Own, so I would like to mention a quote from that particular book. Women have served all these centuries as looking glasses possessing the magic and delicious power of reflecting the figure of man at twice his natural size. In the grand masterpiece that is Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay's Opu trilogy, consisting of Pathir Panchali, Aparajito, and Kajol, Leela appears to have taken very little place among the huge number of female characters that helped, loved, and cared for the protagonist Opu. And yet, it was Leela about whom Opu had the realization that he does not love anyone else as he does Leela. That profound love laced with empathy, which makes a person forget everything, makes them sacrifice themselves. The translation was by me, so please excuse that. Leela was the only character Opu has repeatedly sought out, sometimes not even knowing why. She first appeared towards the end of Pathir Panchali. She was the relative of the family Opu's mother worked for, a girl from the city, and thus didn't conform to the rules of class difference, forming a friendship with Opu, who was essentially a maid's son. While her cousins ridiculed and bullied Opu, always reminding him of his status in their household, Leela welcomed him in their house as a guest, sharing books, poetry, and food with him. Leela was also the first girl in Opu's life who helped him dream beyond his limitations, sharing stories of and planning adventures for the far beyond with him. It is as if she burst through her grey life in rainbow montages, which is a direct quote from Claire Solomon's essay, with her bound copies of Mukul, her gifts for her thread ceremony, and her contagious optimism. Leela's next appearance was in Aparajito, when Opu and Leela were both adults. And since then, Leela made occasional appearances throughout Aparajito till her death towards the end of the book. An adult Opu was starkly reminded of the class difference between him and Leela, perhaps due to the newfound wisdom of adulthood that was blissfully absent during his young adult age. Almost every time they made, since they made for the first time in Aparajito, were mired by the discomfort of meeting an old acquaintance who used to be a great friend. It is interesting to note that Leela and Opu eventually did form a new friendship in their middle age, but only after Leela fell on hard times. It was after her marriage failed and she was faced with dire financial troubles that somehow Leela and Opu became the kind of friends that their childhood selves would have naturally become given a choice. As her own family shunned her, Oppu became perhaps the only refuge a misunderstood Leela had. The specific character arc of Leela can be substantiated as a manic pixie dream girl by the argument Lucia Rodriguez made in her essay that in order for the male protagonist to regain a sense of masculinity and reassert their ego, they must also be imperfect, this they being the manic pixie dream girl. Leela's character is further established as that of a manic pixie dream girl by virtue of the fact that there is actually quite little that the reader knows about her. In fact, the most prominent information about her that seems to be a direct observation is that she is intensely beautiful, ethereally pretty, the likes of which the protagonist Oppu has never seen. Every other piece of information about her comes as a word of mouth by way of multiple characters. Claire Solomon recalled the American film critic George Ebert in her essay, writing how Ebert had described the manic pixie dream girl as one of those creatures you sometimes find in the movies, a girl who is completely available, absolutely desirable, and really likes you. We learn absolutely nothing about her except that she is great to look at and has those positive attributes. Solomon goes on to mention about the manic pixie dream girl that they are lightly pathological, largely mythic. The character is the latest version of the eternal feminine, which perfectly applies to Leela, who remained an exceptional and awe-inspiring presence throughout her life in the story of Oppu, even in her pitiful, destitute death. Manic Pixie Dream Girl as a trope, in spite of all its contributions, is hardly regarded as a...
To interrupt,
yeah.
I think you have exceeded 10 minutes. I'm extremely sorry.
I will conclude in a minute. Is that fine?
Sure.
Yeah. Regarded as a character of substance, who mentions that the sole dramatic and narrative purpose is to inspire the creativity and passion of the fragile, insecure male protagonists, thus perpetuating the myth of women as muses and caregivers, rather than independent entities with a life, dreams, and ambitions of their own. It is without a doubt that Leela's character had immense influence in building the narrative of Oppu's personhood, and at times, due to the language that Vibhushan has actually used about her, it can also be seen that she is given the reverence that is given to the female characters that are directly related to Oppu, such as his sister Durga, his mother Sharbojaya, or his first wife Apurna. And yet, she is not afforded the scope for any growth or to voice any narrative of her own, unlike those characters. Moreover, the omission of the character of Leela from the critically acclaimed film adaptations of the Oppu trilogy further cemented the expendable manner in which the character has been treated. In conclusion, I would like to say that I have read Leela as perhaps one of the first manic pixie dream girls of Bengali literature. Thank you. And I'm really sorry for exceeding the time.
No, not an issue. Thank you so much for such an interesting paper. Now we will take questions. I think there is already a question in the chat box. Others, if you have any questions, you can. Let me just read the question. I think it is for Dr. Shubha Batu. If you could, Shubhati, can you hear me? Yes. Just a second. If you could please comment on the paintings of William Hogarth in depicting the sexualities of the Restoration and 18th century.
A very interesting question from Professor Dotto, and I would like to answer, but time is very short. As we all know that Hogarth had 144 artworks, which are very, very famous. And what I feel is that of them, the two most famous ones are a Harlot's Progress and a Rake's Progress. again, in a Halat progress, actually, we all know that these are the moralistic stories depicted through paintings. And in Halat's progress, we find how an innocent girl becomes a prostitute. So again, we find the depiction of the story.
I'd like to thank each of the participants and professors for such brilliant papers. We can't wait to read the paper in full. Now, the next segment, as we come towards the end of the seminar, webinar, I would request Professor Sanjukta Das, head of the English department, Lady Brabourne College, to deliver her valedictory speech. Ma'am, if you could speak a few words.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, the time has come now to look back at these last 2 evenings. What better point to begin this process than to refer to the story of the tribe mentioned by Dr. Rinita Mojumdar, our keynote speaker, yesterday. The tribe for whom it was forbidden to eat what they grew, but to trade, to exchange with other tribes. For how else would there be economic growth? Within our tribe of the English Studies Fraternity, this webinar on gender and literature has seen more than just a simple exchange between 2 women's colleges located on 2 sides of the Hooghly. It has brought together for 6 hours over the last 2 days students and teachers who are today engaging closely with the discourse of gender as we read literary texts, old and new. The 2 principals, Dr. Ruma Bhattacharya of Bijoy Krishna Girls College, Howrah, and Professor Shivli Sarkar of Lady Brabourne College, have overseen the very important matter of locating dates on a calendar studied at this time with examination processes and election processes. The presentations of the 2 resource persons on the 2 days have, with their excellent collation of valuable pictures, brought alive for us the story of women travelers, specifically women travelers in India and the East, explored by Dr. Porna Ghosh, and the theme of women's writing explained in detail by Professor Shati Ganguly, keeping in mind the pedagogical aspect. Colleagues from the 2 collaborating colleges, as well as several colleges across the state, have focused on a range of literary texts and feminist critical discourses. The student papers by the students of the 2 collaborating institutions have shown how the discourse of gender and literature has become entrenched in academia in the last few decades. Presenting papers on a range of themes from detective fiction, children's fiction, among others, they have presented within the time crunch of a webinar. And hopefully these papers will be available in more detail in the seminar proceedings volume to be published. This exchange between tribal members of the English studies community, this engagement with the theme of gender and literature has been enriching and encyclopedic in range. The experience of this webinar shall sprout new lines of thinking, new paths of exploration. Thanks to the 2 coordinators, Ms. Suyasha Mookim of Bijoy Krishna Girls College and my colleague Ruchira Mondol of the Department of English, Lady Brabourne College, for putting this together and, successfully putting this together. And thank you all for your presence here. Good evening.
Thank you, ma'am. As we come to the fag end of today's academic session, I would request Ms. Suyasha Mookim, head of the department, Bijoy Krishna Girls College, to deliver her vote of thanks.
I would like to thank our principal, Dr. Ruma Bhattacharya, under whose inspiration this international webinar took place. My sincerest thanks to the principal of Lady Brabourne College, Dr. Shivli Sarkar, for accepting my college's offer of collaboration with such prompt willingness. I here have to thank the Department of English of Lady Brabourne College for stepping in at the 11th hour with the permission of their principal with their technical team. Thank you so much.
Suyasha, I would like to disturb you. Actually, the battery got drained out and I could not answer my questions. Would you please give me some scope to answer?
Yes, please do.
Okay, you finish off, then should I do?
Okay, I'll finish off. Special thanks is due to the two IQAC coordinators, Dr. Sweta Guha of Bijoy Krishna Girls College and Dr. Indrani Chaudhuri Dutt of Lady Brabourne College for their continuous support. I wish to thank Professor Rinita Mojumdar for her wide-ranging and extremely thought-provoking deliberation. I wish to thank Dr. Parna Ghosh for throwing light on the almost invisible British females of the Raj. I would also like to thank Professor Shati Ganguly for her invigorating and thought-provoking address. Special thanks are due to the two anchors, Dr. Madhumita Barua of Lady Brabourne College and Ms. Divyarati Ghosh of Bijoy Krishna Girls College for their masterful handling of the event. Thanks is due to the two departments of English of both the colleges for their exhaustive efforts. Special thanks is due to Dr. Nabanita Mukherjee for contacting the resource persons and getting their consent to appear in the webinar. Special thanks is due to Professor Sanjukta Das for her continuous guidance, to Dr. Madhumita Barua for managing communication between both the colleges, and to Ms. Ruchira Mondol for liaisoning with the technical staff. And last but not the least, thanks to the student presenters and all participants for making this webinar a success. Thank you so much. Divyarati, I think you can give Dr. Shubha Basu a chance to answer the question, and then we will say goodbye to everybody, I believe, for the time being.
So it was a wonderful session, and all thanks to the organizers, and thank you to each of the participants as well as students, the guests, dignitaries for making it a success. I would like to end this 2-day-long students webinar on a hopeful note that we meet again with newer agencies and interest, and so looking forward to many such collaborations and meets, and for the benefit of the students as well as for enlightening ourselves. Thank you. Good night.